Section 1. The Origin Story. How Family Guy was almost never made. There is something genuinely strange about the fact that Family Guy exists at all. Not strange in a dismissive way, not strange as a complaint, but strange in the sense that when you trace the actual path that took this show from a young man's imagination all the way to one of the longest-running animated series in American television history, you keep stumbling across moments where everything could have gone differently. Moments where a door closes a few minutes earlier. Moments where a budget number comes back wrong. Moments where a network executive shakes their head and says no, and that is the end of it. The show survived all of those moments, and some of them were far closer calls than most people know. Seth MacFarlane was born in Kent, Connecticut in 1973. From the time he was very young, he was obsessed with drawing and animation in a way that went beyond casual childhood interest. He would sit in front of the television watching cartoons and then pick up a pencil and try to recreate what he had seen, studying the shapes and trying to understand the technique behind them. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed a level of artistic skill that was well beyond what you would expect from someone his age. He was not just watching cartoons passively. He was studying them, treating them as text that contained information he needed. He applied to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most respected art and design schools in the country, and he was accepted. This matters because Rhode Island is not just an address in the show's fictional world. It is where Seth MacFarlane genuinely came from in a creative and personal sense. The state, the culture, the specific texture of New England life that he encountered during his time at that school, all of it fed into the world he would eventually build on television. The fictional town where the Griffins live has a quality of place to it that comes from MacFarlane's own deep familiarity with that corner of the country. While still a student, MacFarlane created a short animated film called The Life of Larry. This was a thesis project, a piece of work he was required to create as part of completing his degree. The short featured a character named Larry, a middle-aged, not particularly bright man who had a talking dog named Steve. If you watch that short today, which you can still find if you know where to look, the DNA of Family Guy is immediately and unmistakably recognizable. Larry is clearly the sketch that Peter Griffin was eventually drawn from, not yet fully formed, but pointing in that exact direction. Steve is obviously the precursor to Brian. The dynamic between them, the relationship between a fundamentally dim man and an articulate, somewhat world-weary dog who seems vaguely embarrassed to be associated with him, is all right there in the first pass, created as a homework assignment by a 20-year-old in art school. MacFarlane was essentially writing the pilot for a show that would not exist for several more years, but he was doing it because it was the thing he genuinely wanted to make, rather than because anyone had asked him to make it. That distinction matters. The creative energy in those early shorts came from the inside. It was not shaped by network requirements or audience research or any of the other forces that typically sculpt television comedy by the time it reaches your screen. It was one person figuring out what he found funny and building a world around it. His professor at Rhode Island School of Design was so impressed with The Life of Larry that he submitted it to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for characters like Yogi Bear, the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and dozens of other properties that had defined American children's entertainment for decades. Hanna-Barbera hired MacFarlane right out of college, which is an extraordinarily fortunate outcome for a recent graduate, and he went to work writing for animated series that were airing on Cartoon Network at the time. He contributed to Johnny Bravo. He worked on Cow and Chicken. He contributed material to Dexter's Laboratory. These were not the most artistically adventurous assignments in the world, but they gave him something invaluable. A real education in how professional animation actually works at an industrial level, what makes a joke land in that specific medium, how timing functions differently when drawings are doing the performing rather than live actors, how a writing room operates under deadline pressure. Working in that environment also meant MacFarlane was in close proximity to the machinery of animation production in ways that most creative people who later run their own shows never experience. He was not just a writer. He understood the pipeline, from script to storyboard to the overseas studios where the actual frame-by-frame drawing happened, to the editing room, to the final broadcast product. That comprehensive understanding of the production process would prove significant when he eventually had to build a whole show from the ground up on a very small budget. During that period at Hanna-Barbera, he made a second short film, This one was called Larry and Steve, and it was a direct follow-up to his thesis project. It aired in 1997 as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons programming block, a platform the network used to showcase new animated short films and potentially develop them into full series. McFarlane had taken his original Larry and Steve concept and refined it, pushed it further, gotten better at articulating what made the two characters interesting together. The short performed well enough that it caught the attention of people beyond just Cartoon Network. Executives at Fox saw the Larry and Steve short and contacted McFarlane directly. They were interested in whether there was a full series somewhere inside that concept. McFarlane believed there was. He had been developing the idea in his head for years by that point, building out what the world around these characters would look like, who their family members and neighbors would be, what the show's specific sense of humor would feel like. Fox asked him to come in and pitch. Here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody knows about. The show that McFarlane originally considered for Fox was not exactly what became Family Guy. The original plan, before Fox got seriously involved, was for the Larry and Steve concept to potentially become a series of short animated films for a sketch comedy program called Mad TV. McFarlane had assumed that when Fox's television division called him in, they might be interested in that same kind of limited format, animated shorts for an existing show. He went into that meeting with relatively modest expectations. Fox thought much bigger. When they saw what McFarlane had brought them, they told him they did not want animated shorts for a sketch show. They wanted a full primetime animated series. They were looking at what The Simpsons had built through the late 1980s and 1990s, and they wanted another show that could anchor their Sunday night lineup. McFarlane was 23 years old and had been out of college for about 2 years. He was suddenly being asked to create a primetime network show from scratch, which is not a thing that generally happens to 23-year-olds. Fox gave him $50,000 and asked him to produce a 15-minute pilot. This was a remarkably small budget, even by the standards of the late 1990s, a fraction of what a live-action television pilot would cost. McFarlane essentially locked himself in his apartment and worked around the clock for months. He wrote the script, drew character designs, built storyboards, produced voice demos, assembled as much of the pilot as he could with the tools available to him. The show he was creating was no longer just Larry and Steve and their simple dynamic. It was a whole family, a whole community. Peter Griffin had emerged as the renamed and substantially expanded version of Larry, but now he had a wife and children and a whole supporting cast of neighbors and friends and recurring characters. Brian the dog had evolved considerably from the simpler Steve. Lois was a new creation, a character the original shorts had not included. The children were new. Stewie, the evil infant with the British accent and the world domination ambitions, was an invention specific to this expanded world, a character unlike anything McFarlane had done before, something genuinely original in the landscape of animated television. The 15-minute pilot that McFarlane delivered to Fox in 1998 impressed the network executives enough that they made a commitment most people in the industry would call extraordinary. They not only greenlit the show, they ordered it straight to series. No extended development period, no additional testing rounds, no pilot season in the traditional sense. They wanted Family Guy on television as soon as possible, and they placed it in one of the most coveted time slots available to any program on American network television, the Sunday night slot immediately following the Super Bowl. On the 31st of January 1999, Family Guy made its first appearance on American television screens. The Super Bowl that year, number 33 in the sequence, had just concluded, and while tens of millions of people were still sitting on their couches with their snacks in their hands, this new animated show about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family came on the screen for the very first time. 22 million people watched that first episode. For a brand new show with no established audience, no accumulated word of mouth, no history at all, that was a staggering number. It was the kind of debut that justified every bit of confidence the network had placed in McFarlane's pitch. The show that aired those first 15 episodes had a quality to it that is difficult to fully describe to someone who has only ever experienced the later seasons. It was rough in places, certainly. The animation was not always consistent from episode to episode. Some of the jokes were broader and less refined than what the show would develop over time. But there was a warmth running through it that felt entirely genuine. The Griffin family, for all of their chaos and dysfunction, seemed like they actually cared about each other in meaningful ways. Peter's stupidity was played as lovable rather than cruel or dangerous. He was a man who made consistently terrible decisions, but who genuinely loved his wife and his children, and you could feel that love underneath the comedy. Stewie's murderous ambitions toward Lois were played as genuinely menacing while also being completely absurd. This tiny baby in a diaper with a British accent sitting in his high chair, eating his breakfast cereal, while calmly describing his plans to acquire weapons of mass destruction. The humor came from the absolute contrast between what he looked like and what he was saying. Brian was the voice of reason, the one character who looked at whatever disaster was unfolding and reacted the way a thoughtful person would react. He was Peter's best friend in a relationship that felt genuinely warm underneath all the banter. He was a failed writer, trying to be taken seriously in a world that saw him as a novelty. And then, Fox canceled it. The story of the first cancellation is not as dramatic as the second, but it matters enormously for understanding what the show was and what would eventually happen to it. The ratings after that enormous Super Bowl debut did not sustain at 22 million, but nothing ever does after a post-Super Bowl slot. The show averaged around 12.8 million households in its first season and finished ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings overall, which for a brand new animated series was genuinely solid performance. The trouble started in the second season when Fox began moving the show around the schedule, seemingly without much thought given to audience habit. They put it on Thursday nights in its second season, which placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, one of the most critically acclaimed and consistently watched comedies then airing on television. The ratings dropped under that pressure. Fox moved it to Tuesday nights, where it went against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, a show that was at the absolute peak of its cultural dominance in those years and was drawing enormous audiences. The ratings dropped again. The scheduling chaos continued through the third season, and by 2002, Fox made the decision to pull the plug entirely. This cancellation was not a reflection of what the show was worth creatively or even commercially. It was a reflection of what happens when a network mishandles its own programming, when it fails to give a show the consistency and stability that audience habit requires. MacFarlane has talked about this in interviews with unmistakable frustration. He watched the show he had spent years building get shuffled around the schedule like a piece on a game board while the audience struggled to find it from week to week. One of the lasting effects of those early years of instability, which MacFarlane has acknowledged directly, was the constant disruption of the writing staff. When you do not know if your show is coming back next season, the writers have to make career decisions that a stable production would not require of them. Some stay out of loyalty or hope. Others take jobs elsewhere because they cannot afford to wait on a show that may never come back. When the show returns, you are not working with the same room that built it. That cycle of disruption and reconstruction, happening repeatedly before the show had even finished establishing its identity, would shape everything that came afterward in ways that are difficult to fully quantify. But the story did not end in 2002. It was just pausing. And the events of the next 3 years would produce something that television had never really seen before at that scale, a genuine resurrection of a dead show driven entirely by the passionate engagement of an audience that the industry had not yet learned to properly measure. Hey, before we go further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now with the time and place where you are watching this. It never gets old seeing where these videos travel. And if you have been watching for a while and have not subscribed yet, please do it now. It helps more than you could know, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Section 2. The Man Behind the Curtain, Seth MacFarlane's Real-Life Secrets. Most people who watch Family Guy know Seth MacFarlane as a name in the credits, or as the voice behind 4 of the show's main characters. What fewer people think about is the fact that MacFarlane's actual biography is one of the more remarkable stories in American entertainment history, and that parts of his life have bled into the show in ways that are not always obvious, but become fascinating once you start to look for them. The voice work alone is worth spending real time on. When you sit down and watch an episode of Family Guy, you are hearing Seth MacFarlane perform as Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire, sometimes within the same scene, sometimes within moments of each other, sometimes within the same continuous conversation. These are not similar voices, not variations on a theme. They are distinct and fully realized vocal performances that require completely different physical and technical approaches to produce. Peter Griffin is a nasally, somewhat whiny voice that carries just enough working-class weight to feel plausible and grounded. There is a specific quality to Peter's voice that communicates stupidity without caricature, a kind of vocal roundness that makes him sound perpetually slightly confused even when the content of what he is saying is not particularly confused. Brian is smoother and more controlled, the voice of a character who considers himself educated and culturally sophisticated, with a dry edge to the delivery that signals distance and irony. Stewie is the most stylized and technically demanding of the four, that clipped and refined, faintly British accent layered over the cadence of someone who has absorbed far too many theatrical villain tropes from films and literature, a voice that is simultaneously impressive and deeply silly because of the obvious mismatch between the sound and the tiny person producing it. Quagmire is something else entirely, a kind of exaggerated retro lounge singer energy, always on the edge of either a punchline or a deeply inappropriate observation. McFarlane developed these voices over years of practice and deliberate construction. The voice of Peter was partly inspired by a security guard he knew during his time at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is a specific and somewhat unlikely origin for one of the most recognizable character voices in animation history. McFarlane absorbed the qualities of that real person's voice and exaggerated and reshaped them into something that fit the character he was building. The voice of Stewie required the most deliberate architectural thinking. McFarlane wanted Stewie to sound like a villain, but a very specific variety of villain, the theatrical arch-nemesis type from older films who announces his plans in full before attempting to carry them out, whose confidence is both genuine and slightly absurd. He drew on classic British film villains, on the particular cadence of mid-20th century theatrical performance, on the kind of character who would dramatically monologue rather than simply act. For recording sessions, McFarlane typically works through all of his characters in sequence. Family Guy, like most animated shows, records its voice work first before the animation is produced, because the animation is keyed to the performances rather than the other way around. This means McFarlane sits in a recording booth and essentially performs scenes with himself, switching between four very different characters and their entirely distinct vocal approaches, sometimes mid-conversation if two of his characters are interacting directly. The mental code switching required to do this quickly, accurately, and with genuine comedic timing over multiple hours of recording is a specific and extraordinary skill. William H. Macy very nearly became the voice of Brian Griffin. This is documented and confirmed in multiple sources, and McFarlane has spoken about it himself on social media, describing it as a decision he regrets. When the show was casting its voice roles in 1997, McFarlane auditioned Macy for the role of Brian and reportedly felt afterward that he had perhaps made the wrong choice. Macy had previous experience with animal character voice work, having voiced a character called Leo Lionheart in a different animated production, and the dry, intelligent, somewhat world-weary quality that defined Brian's characterization would have suited Macy's delivery style extremely well. The reason Macy did not ultimately receive the role appears to have been primarily financial rather than creative. The show's budget, which was tight throughout its development period, made it more practical for McFarlane himself to voice multiple characters. This economic constraint ended up shaping the sonic identity of the entire show, because McFarlane's voice became the backbone of the Griffin household in a way that defined how the show sounded for its entire run. The character of Chris Griffin has a peculiar and somewhat dark origin story for his voice. Seth Green, who had appeared in films like Can't Hardly Wait and the Austin Powers franchise, came in to audition for the role. He was apparently dared by a friend to attempt his best impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer villain from Jonathan Demme's 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs. This is the character who memorably dances alone in his basement, in a sequence that lodged itself into the cultural memory of anyone who saw it, one of the more genuinely disturbing pieces of cinema from that decade. Green performed the impression for the audition. McFarlane and the casting team found it funny enough and usable enough to become the foundation of Chris Griffin's voice, which is why, if you listen to Chris Griffin carefully, there is something slightly off about the rhythms of his speech, a heaviness and a flatness that is simultaneously comedic and inexplicably unsettling. The show later acknowledged this origin directly, in an episode where Meg embarrasses Chris in front of the school by showing a video of him parodying the Buffalo Bill dance from The Silence of the Lambs. The scene exists on one level as a joke about Chris's humiliation, but it is also a hidden acknowledgement of where his voice actually came from, a piece of behind-the-scenes history folded into the fiction of the show. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois Griffin from the beginning, based the character's voice on a real person, a cousin from Great Neck, New York. The particular quality of Lois's voice, that slightly strained, faintly Long Island affluence that communicates someone who grew up with money but does not quite fully inhabit that identity, came from someone Borstein actually knew. Borstein had been a writer and performer for Mad TV before joining Family Guy, which creates a small but perfect loop back to the show's own origins. Since Family Guy had originally been considered as a potential source of animated content for Mad TV before Fox stepped in with larger ambitions, Mila Kunis took over the role of Meg Griffin starting in the second season, after Lacey Chabert voiced the character through the show's first 15 episodes. The transition was relatively seamless to most viewers because Meg's role in Season 1 was limited enough that there was not yet a strongly established vocal identity to maintain. Kunis has spoken in interviews about the strange experience of voicing a character who spent so many seasons being defined entirely by her suffering and victimhood. She described the particular strangeness of being told in real social interactions that people would use the catchphrase that became associated with Meg's abuse on the show directed at her, the real human being providing the voice, blurring the line between a fictional character's mistreatment and the reality of the person performing that character. Seth MacFarlane's personal biography contains one moment that stands entirely apart from anything else in this story, a real-world near-miss with catastrophe that is so specific and so verifiable and so consequential that it changes how you think about the existence of Family Guy entirely. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to fly from Boston, Massachusetts to Los Angeles, California on American Airlines Flight 11. He had been in Rhode Island giving a lecture at his former school, the Rhode Island School of Design, and was returning to California. The night before the flight, he went out with some friends after the lecture and stayed out later than he should have. He had more to drink than was wise for someone who needed to be at an airport early the following morning. He woke up the next day with a hangover. There was also a logistical error. His travel agent had given him the wrong departure time for his flight, listing it as 8:15 in the morning rather than the correct 7:45 departure. Between the hangover slowing his morning and the incorrect time he had been given, MacFarlane arrived at the airport approximately 10 minutes after the gates for Flight 11 had closed. The airline told him he had missed the flight and would need to wait for a later departure. He went to the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up approximately 40 minutes later to commotion and noise around him. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City at 8:46 in the morning, killing everyone on board. MacFarlane had missed the flight by 10 minutes. He has talked about this experience in interviews over the years with a characteristic directness that avoids both dramatization and false equanimity. He was shaken by it in the immediate aftermath, he has said. He called his assistant, who had been waiting to hear from him and who had been dealing with the terrifying possibility that MacFarlane had been on the plane. He eventually sent his travel agent a basket of alcohol as a thank you, acknowledging that the wrong departure time she had given him was part of what saved his life. When asked in interviews whether the experience made him feel like fate had intervened or like he was living on borrowed time, his answer was consistently measured. He did not believe in those frameworks. Coincidences happened. He had missed other flights for other reasons at other times. This one had terrible consequences that he happened to avoid. There is a specific strangeness to the relationship between that day and the show he had created. Family Guy had already been canceled before the 11th of September 2001. The show that MacFarlane had built was gone, at least temporarily. If he had been on that flight, Family Guy as we know it would have ended with 3 seasons and a canceled status. There would have been no revival. There would have been no Adult Swim renaissance, no DVD phenomenon, no long second life for the Griffins. American Dad would not have existed. The specific shape of American adult animation from 2005 onward would have been substantially different. Also on that flight were David and Lynn Angel, David being one of the creators of Frasier, the NBC comedy that Family Guy had been moved into competition with in its second season, partly contributing to the ratings decline that led to its first real cancellation. These are the kinds of connections that are not meaningful in any causal sense, but that hover at the edges of the story in ways that are impossible to look away from entirely. MacFarlane's own politics and worldview are woven through Family Guy in ways that became more visible as the years went on. He is an outspoken atheist, and his feelings about religion show up repeatedly in the show's humor, sometimes subtly and sometimes conspicuously. He is politically liberal, and Brian Griffin in particular became a vehicle for those views in later seasons in ways that caused significant audience friction. MacFarlane has acknowledged in interviews that Brian's later characterization became a problem, partly because he was being used to say things MacFarlane himself believed, and the line between a character having opinions and a creator using a character as a lecture platform had become blurred in ways that were not serving the comedy. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company entirely away from the Fox network ecosystem. His newer projects were being made for platforms that had no connection to Fox. In 2021, he posted publicly on social media that his feelings about Family Guy's continued association with Fox had become genuinely complicated, comparing the situation to a failing marriage where both parties knew it was not working. The creator of one of Fox's longest-running shows was publicly saying he wanted out of the relationship while remaining contractually obligated to remain in it. This dynamic, a creator who had emotionally moved on from his creation while still being required to perform its characters, tells you something important about what the show was in its later phases. It was not driven by MacFarlane's creative passion. It was sustained by contractual reality and economic utility. Family Guy made money for multiple parties. As long as it made money, it continued. The art and the economics had completely decoupled, which is not unusual for long-running commercial entertainment, but which is useful to understand when trying to make sense of what the show became in its final form. The shorts that started it all. A deeper look at the origin, the shorts that started it all. The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve were not polished professional productions. They were short animated films made by someone who was still figuring out what kind of animator he wanted to become, who had not yet made the specific decisions about character and tone and comedic sensibility that would eventually define his mature work. MacFarlane made the first of these, The Life of Larry, while still a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, completing it as his senior thesis project in 1995. The project ran to approximately 9 minutes and centered on a large, heavy-set, not particularly intelligent man named Larry and his anthropomorphic dog companion Steve, who could speak and reason at a human level despite existing in a world that treated him as a domestic animal. Watch The Life of Larry now, knowing what it eventually became, and the experience is unusual in a specific way. It is clearly the work of someone who has not found his full voice yet. The timing is rougher than what Family Guy would later achieve. The character designs are sketched rather than refined. The jokes land with different degrees of success, but the essential engine of the comedy is recognizable. The gap between Larry's actual intelligence and the situations he finds himself in produces a specific kind of humor, the comedy of a man who lacks the insight to understand why everything keeps going wrong for him, but who nonetheless keeps engaging with the world with undiminished enthusiasm. Steve the dog serves as his more perceptive companion, capable of observing what Larry cannot, commenting on it in ways that Larry either ignores or misses entirely. MacFarlane sent The Life of Larry to Hanna-Barbera, the studio that had produced some of the foundational work in American animated comedy, including The Flintstones and Yogi Bear, and dozens of other productions that had shaped what animated comedy looked and sounded like in the American imagination. Hanna-Barbera was not at that point the creative force it had been in its earlier decades, but it was still a working studio producing animated content for television, and MacFarlane's submission caught enough attention for him to be offered a job. He was hired by Hanna-Barbera in 1995, fresh out of school. He spent several years at the studio doing animation work on existing productions. He worked on Johnny Bravo, the animated comedy about a vain, muscular man who constantly fails at romance despite his confident belief in his own attractiveness. He contributed to Cow and Chicken and its spin-off I Am Weasel. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory, the animated comedy about a boy genius with a hidden laboratory who is perpetually thwarted by his apparently dim-witted sister, Dee Dee. These were shows with clear audience demographics and established production cultures, and working on them gave McFarlane an intimate practical education in how animated comedy was actually made within a professional studio environment. During this period, he made a second short film, Larry and Steve, which refined and developed the characters from the life of Larry in ways that made them more recognizably precursor versions of Peter and Brian. The short was commissioned by Cartoon Network as part of a programming package and aired in 1997. In Larry and Steve, the relationship between the two characters has more clarity. Larry is more clearly the center of the comedy, the person whose perspective filters everything. Steve is more clearly his intellectual counterpart and reluctant guide through situations that Larry does not understand. The dynamic is not identical to what Peter and Brian would eventually be, but the structural relationship, the dumb, lovable human, and the smarter dog who is simultaneously his best friend and his conscience, is there. The step from Larry and Steve to the Family Guy pitch was not a simple translation. McFarlane was not just packaging his existing characters in a different format. He was fundamentally reconceiving what the project was. The short films had centered on Larry and Steve as the complete unit of attention. The Family Guy pitch embedded their equivalents in a domestic family structure that created additional characters, additional relationships, additional sources of conflict and comedy. He gave Peter a wife with her own personality and history. He gave them children with distinct identities rather than generic child character placeholders. He added the innovation of Stewie, who had no direct equivalent in the short films, and who represented a genuinely new idea rather than a developed version of an existing one. The pitch to Fox happened in May of 1998. McFarlane was 24 years old. The project he was pitching was not a fully developed series Bible with comprehensive documentation of characters, settings, and story directions. It was a concept with a demonstrated creative voice, a 15-minute animated pilot that Fox executives could watch and form opinions about. The pilot cost $50,000 to produce. McFarlane made it with resources assembled from his Hanna-Barbera connections and his own energy. The pilot's quality was sufficient to convince Fox that the person who had made it understood how to make the show that it suggested. Fox greenlit the series. McFarlane's deal gave him creative control at a level that was unusual for a show of this kind at this stage of the creator's career. He was 24 years old and had never run a television production. He was being given the resources and the authority to build one from scratch. The confidence Fox placed in him was not without commercial logic. The pilot was compelling enough to justify the investment, but the trust extended was significant, and it shaped the show that resulted. A creator with genuine control over his production makes different decisions than a creator working within a structure that mediates his judgment. The early Family Guy, in its specific identity and its specific voice, bears the mark of that control throughout. The voice is how characters sounded before they sounded right. The voice casting process for Family Guy's original run produced results that have remained essentially stable through 25 years of production, which is an unusual level of casting consistency for any television production across that time frame. The core voice performers have stayed with the show in large part because the characters they voice are extensions of their particular vocal capabilities in ways that make replacement genuinely difficult to imagine. McFarlane voices 4 of the main characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. This level of multi-character performance is not unique in animation, but it is notable, and it gives the show a quality that is more difficult to describe than to experience. When you know that Peter and Brian are both coming from the same person, the dynamics between them change slightly in your perception. McFarlane is in dialogue with himself when these characters interact. The choices he makes as Peter are choices made with full awareness of the choices he will make as Brian, and vice versa. The unconscious musical knowledge of how these voices fit together comes from a single performer's understanding of both. Peter's voice draws on a Boston regional accent with its specific flattened vowels and dropped R's, applied to a vocal delivery that sits somewhere between genuine affection for the character and mild contempt for his limitations. MacFarlane has described finding Peter's voice as a process of discovering what Peter's particular combination of confidence and vacancy would sound like if it had a specifically regional American quality rather than a generic television American voice. The result is immediately recognizable and has a quality of familiarity that makes the character feel located in a real American demographic tradition rather than in an animated comedy convention. Brian's voice is MacFarlane doing something closer to his own speaking voice, elevated slightly toward a performed dry wit. The choice to ground Brian's voice in recognizable naturalness, rather than in the kind of distinctive vocal marking that characters like Stewie and Peter carry, was itself a characterization decision. Brian sounds like a person who is trying to sound like a person, which is precisely what his character is doing throughout the show's run. Stewie's voice emerged from MacFarlane's engagement with mid-century theatrical British performance traditions. Rex Harrison's speaking voice is one reference point that MacFarlane has mentioned. The quality he was after was aristocratic certainty delivered in a slightly larger register than naturalistic conversation requires, the vocal style of someone who expected to be listened to and had organized his entire relationship to speech around that expectation. Applying this to a baby character, with the inherent absurdity of its placement, creates the core joke of the voice before Stewie has said a specific word. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois from the beginning of the show's run, found the character's vocal identity through an imitation of a specific real person, a relative from a particular American Jewish community on Long Island who had a distinctive way of managing her vowels and her rhythm. The decision to base Lois's voice in a specific observed reality rather than in a generic television mother archetype, gave the character an authenticity that generic choices would not have produced. Lois sounds like someone whose particular regional and social background has shaped how she speaks, which makes her feel more like a person than a type. Mila Kunis came to Meg's voice under unusual circumstances. The character had been voiced in the first season by Lacey Chabert, a young actress who was simultaneously dealing with obligations to the show Party of Five and found the combined workload unmanageable. Kunis, who was 17 years old when she auditioned for the replacement role, reportedly did not tell the production she was 17 during the audition process. She gave a reading that the production responded to, and she was cast. She has voiced Meg ever since. The decision to continue having Meg voiced by a young actress rather than by a performer with no connection to Meg's specific demographic created an occasional additional dimension to the character's treatment. Kunis has discussed in interviews the experience of lending her voice to a character who was treated with consistent cruelty by the show, describing the specific quality of sitting in a recording booth delivering lines in which the character she was voicing was subjected to humiliation and abuse, and the mixed feelings that produced. Seth Green's Chris Griffin emerged from Green's facility with character voices applied in a direction that the actor has described as drawing on aspects of performers whose vocal quality suggested a certain kind of large, sweet, not especially clever young person. The particular Buffalo Bill vocal note that some observers have identified in early Chris was a specific choice that the show gradually moderated as Chris's character became more broadly defined as an awkward teenage boy rather than something more specifically strange. Section 3. The Resurrection: How Dead DVDs Brought a Show Back from the Grave. The story of how Family Guy came a middle from cancellation is genuinely one of the more interesting events in American television history, and it happened largely because of technology that the television industry was not yet sure how to understand or measure. The show did not return because Fox suddenly realized they had made a mistake. It did not return because of a letter-writing campaign, though fan enthusiasm was real and organized. It returned because the entertainment industry was grappling with a fundamental new reality about how people consumed entertainment, and Family Guy happened to be in exactly the right position to prove something that permanently changed how networks thought about their own programming. When Fox canceled Family Guy at the end of Season 3 in 2002, the general assumption within the television industry was that this was a final and permanent decision. Shows that get canceled once occasionally come back. Shows that get canceled twice almost never return, and when they do, the return is typically brief and unsuccessful. Family Guy had now been canceled twice, first briefly at the end of its second season and then definitively after its third. The creative team had been scattered. The writing staff had moved on to other projects. The equipment had been stored. The show appeared to be finished in every practical sense. Cartoon Network had been watching this situation with genuine interest from the outside. They operated a late-night programming block called Adult Swim, designed specifically for adult viewers who were staying up after the traditional family-friendly hours. Adult Swim was always looking for content to fill those hours without spending enormous production budgets. Family Guy was a canceled show with an existing audience and completed, ready-to-broadcast episodes available for acquisition. The network that had been paying to air Family Guy had canceled it and no longer valued it. This meant Cartoon Network could acquire the rights to those episodes for almost nothing, because nobody involved thought the property was worth much anymore. Adult Swim began airing Family Guy reruns on the 20th of April 2003. What happened in the following weeks and months was something that nobody in television had seen at quite that scale before. The show did not simply perform adequately in reruns. It dominated. It immediately became the highest-rated program in the entire Adult Swim late-night lineup. Cartoon Network reported that Family Guy's arrival boosted the overall viewership for the Adult Swim block by 239%. This was not a modest improvement. This was a transformation of the entire programming environment. The show had found its audience, and its audience had found the show, and the resulting numbers were extraordinary. The question that immediately and reasonably occurred to anyone paying attention was, where had this audience been when the show was originally on Fox? If this many people wanted to watch Family Guy, why had the show's ratings been soft enough to justify 2 cancellations? The answer is complicated and points towards several converging factors that were specific to that moment in television history. Fox's scheduling chaos during Family Guy's original run had made it structurally difficult for viewers to build the kind of habit that drives reliable ratings. When a show moves between multiple different nights and different time slots within a relatively short period, without much advance notice, the casual viewer simply loses track of it. The show is no longer where they expected it to be. They watch something else. The habit breaks. This is not a reflection of how much they like the show. It is a reflection of how disrupted the viewing experience became. Second, and this turned out to be the more structurally significant factor, the demographic that was most enthusiastic about Family Guy was one that the television industry was not yet adequately counting. College students watching shows in dormitories were not typically inside the Nielsen sample. Young adults in shared living situations were similarly invisible. People who watched television at unconventional hours or in unconventional ways did not generate the kind of data that the industry used to make its programming decisions. These were real viewers, genuinely committed to the show, willing to seek it out even when the network made it difficult to find. But they were largely absent from the measurements that determined whether a show lived or died. Adult Swim's late-night slot was more hospitable to precisely this viewer. The late-night cable experience was different from the primetime broadcast experience in ways that worked to the show's advantage. Watching Adult Swim at midnight required a degree of active choice. You were staying up specifically to watch, which meant the audience skewed more committed and more attentive. They were also the specific kind of viewer who told their friends about things, who created the word of mouth that spread the show's audience further. At the same time as the Adult Swim reruns were generating these extraordinary numbers, something else entirely was happening in the home entertainment market. The DVD releases of Family Guy's first and second seasons arrived in stores in 2003. This was relatively early in the mainstream adoption of television shows on DVD. The format was still establishing itself as a reliable revenue stream. Family Guy's DVD releases, timed with the Adult Swim revival, became an unexpected cultural event. The first volume, covering the show's first 2 seasons, sold 1.67 million units and topped the charts for all television DVD sales in 2003. Not animated television, not canceled television, all television. The second volume sold another 1 million units. These were numbers that nobody in the industry had projected for a show that had been canceled twice. People were not just watching the reruns on Adult Swim. They were buying the episodes, owning them, watching them again on their own schedules, sharing them with people who had not been watching during the original run. The DVD format allowed viewers to experience the show completely on their own terms, without network scheduling decisions interfering, without the constant uncertainty of whether the show would be where they expected it to be the following week. The experience of watching Family Guy on DVD was meaningfully and qualitatively different from watching it on Fox in 2000, and millions of people were discovering that they liked that experience. There is a cultural phenomenon at work in this period, that the television industry was just beginning to encounter and did not yet have good vocabulary for. A show could be genuinely beloved and widely discussed and culturally significant, while still having mediocre traditional broadcast ratings, because the people doing the loving and discussing were not being measured in the ways that mattered. The internet was becoming a space where passionate communities formed around entertainment properties and kept them alive well after broadcast metrics had declared them dead. Family Guy had one of those communities, and the community had been building itself quietly through forum posts and early video sharing and in-person conversation, while the industry was looking at Nielsen numbers and seeing nothing. Family Guy was one of the first shows to benefit visibly and dramatically from this invisible enthusiasm, translating into concrete commercial data. The combination of those extraordinary Adult Swim numbers and millions of DVD units sold was something that Fox could no longer interpret as anything other than evidence that a substantial, committed audience existed. By 2004, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice was in active conversations about bringing it back for a fourth season. Fox ordered a fourth season. The announcement was made in 2004, and the show was scheduled to return in May of 2005. The fan response was unlike anything most people in television had seen. People who had mourned the show's cancellation were experiencing something almost unprecedented, the genuine and complete resurrection of a program they had given up on. Entertainment journalism treated it as a significant story, which it genuinely was. Because this kind of revival, based on this kind of secondary market data rather than traditional audience recovery, was not a thing that had happened before at this scale. The show came back, but it came back into a different ecosystem than the one it had left. 3 years had passed. The writing staff had scattered. Some of the original writers who had built the show's voice and sensibility had moved on to other projects and were not available or willing to return. The room that MacFarlane assembled for Season 4 was not the original room. It contained new people who were talented, but who had not been present for the formative decisions that shaped the show's early identity. The tone had to be rebuilt, partly from memory, and partly from the instincts of people encountering the world of the Griffins for the first time. Season 4 is not bad television by any honest measure. It contains excellent episodes and genuinely sharp humor, but something has shifted. The warmth has cooled. The characters are beginning to pull in directions that were not fully established in the earlier seasons. The cutaway gags, which in seasons 1 through 3 had been quick and pointed additions to an otherwise solid story, were beginning to claim more of the episode's real estate. What had been seasoning was starting to become a main course. None of this was obvious in the immediate excitement of the revival. But looking back from the other end of the show's run, you can see the seeds of everything that would follow planted in those early post-revival episodes. Section 4. The Stewie Mystery. Who can actually hear him? Of all the unresolved questions that run through Family Guy's more than 25 years on television, the one that has generated the most sustained and creative speculation among the show's most dedicated viewers is deceptively simple to state. When Stewie Griffin speaks, who can actually hear him? The show has never provided a clean, consistent, durable answer to this question, and the inconsistency is so thorough and so persistent across so many seasons that it eventually stops functioning as a continuity error and starts looking like something more deliberately maintained. In the earliest episodes of the show, the operating premise seemed reasonably clear. Stewie talked at length and with elaborate sophistication about world domination, about his plans to eliminate Lois, about the weapons systems he was developing in his crib, about his assessments of the other characters' intellectual capacities, about everything and anything that entered his brilliantly malevolent mind. The other characters generally did not respond to any of this as if they had heard it. They interacted with him the way adults interact with toddlers, cooing at him, handing him things, treating him with the gentle condescension that small children typically receive from the world. The comedy arose from this enormous gap between Stewie's total seriousness about his ambitions and the complete obliviousness of the adults supposedly watching over him. Brian was the consistent exception. From the early episodes forward, Brian and Stewie could have genuine conversations. Brian responded to Stewie's actual words, engaged with his reasoning, pushed back on his plans, treated him as an equal in a dialogue rather than as a baby making sounds. Their friendship was built on this shared communicative register, on Brian being somehow tuned to the same frequency as this extraordinary infant while everyone else remained static. But the show's actual execution of these rules was never clean. In a significant number of episodes across the entire run, other characters clearly heard Stewie and responded to him appropriately, only for the same characters in other episodes to proceed as if his words were inaudible or meaningless. Peter Griffin, who by the show's internal logic should rarely if ever understand his youngest son, would occasionally react directly and specifically to something Stewie said. Lois, who was supposedly the target of Stewie's most sustained antagonism and who was established as not hearing him, would sometimes demonstrate comprehension in moments that were inconsistent with everything around them. The rules bent and shifted constantly, episode by episode, sometimes within a single episode. The show eventually addressed this inconsistency directly, though in a way that raised as many questions as it resolved. In 2015, the show's executive producer, Rich Apple, offered what he framed as the working rule. Within the family unit, Brian always understands Stewie, and sometimes Chris does as well. But Peter, Lois, and essentially the entire outside world hear something closer to babbling than to the sophisticated dialogue that the audience receives. This explanation makes logical sense as a conceptual framework. It does not, however, match the observable behavior of the show across its actual run. The rule had been violated so many times before Appel articulated it that articulating it could not retroactively clean up the record. The season 20 premiere, titled Stewie's First Word, took the question further into canonical territory than any previous episode had attempted. The episode's plot centered on Stewie suddenly being understood by everyone around him, producing his first words in a manner that the whole family could hear. Stewie's own explanation for this development, when asked by a bewildered Brian who had understood him perfectly well for years, was that he had been feeling such intense emotion in that moment that the words had somehow broken through whatever barrier normally existed. This explanation is deliberately and conspicuously vague. It does not commit the show to any specific rule about what has been happening for over 2 decades. It acknowledges the question's existence without answering it. The most structurally satisfying fan theory about this inconsistency proposes that the show is being experienced through Stewie's own perceptual framework, that what we see and hear as the audience is not objective reality, but Stewie's interpretation of reality filtered through the cognitive equipment of a 1-year-old child. Under this reading, the people who understand Stewie in any given scene are the people who, in that moment, appear to him to be paying attention to him. The people who do not understand him are those who have, in his perception, tuned him out the way adults tune out infants. Brian always understands him because Stewie experiences their relationship as one of genuine mutual attention and recognition. Peter and Lois understand him inconsistently because their attentiveness to him is itself inconsistent from his perspective. The theory produces interesting secondary implications. If the show is Stewie's perception of the world, then the exaggerations are his exaggerations. Peter's spectacular stupidity is not objective fact, but Stewie's characterization of a man he finds frustrating and incomprehensible. Lois's antagonism toward him is his experience of maternal authority and restriction, exaggerated through the emotional framework of someone who has not yet developed the cognitive tools to put these experiences in proportion. The cutaway gags, which have no narrative logic in a realistic interpretation of the show, become free association, the infant mind's tendency to follow one idea into another without the connecting tissue that adult narration requires. There is a darker version of the same theoretical territory, one that a number of fans have developed independently and that arrives at a genuinely unsettling reading of what the show might be. This theory begins with a catastrophic event in Peter Griffin's past. Something went terribly wrong before the show begins, in most versions of the theory involving the deaths of some or all of the children. Unable to process the grief, Peter's mind constructed an elaborate protective fantasy in which everything was still intact, in which his family was still alive and the world was still functioning. And the Family Guy we watch is the content of that fantasy. What we watch across the seasons of Family Guy is this protective fantasy and the increasingly disturbing behavior of Peter in the later seasons, the cruelty and the recklessness and the apparent indifference to consequence. Is the fantasy degrading under the pressure of the underlying reality it is trying to conceal? The warmth of the early seasons reflects a mind in relatively good functioning, capable of maintaining a version of family life that resembles something real. The escalating darkness of the later seasons reflects a mind under increasing strain, producing more distorted versions of the people it is trying to recreate. The reversal of episodes, the way significant consequences are consistently undone and everything resets, is a feature of the fantasy mechanism rather than a writing failure. A mind protecting itself from loss cannot allow the fantasy to actually progress toward resolution, because resolution might mean acknowledgement. Stewie's extraordinary genius in this reading is explained by Peter having never actually met this child. The baby that died or was never born exists in Peter's imagination as a projection of potential, and the mind, when inventing someone rather than remembering them, invents them as extraordinary. The fact that the show never lets Stewie actually succeed at anything, that his elaborate schemes always fail, is consistent with the limits of a fantasy, the subconscious awareness that the extraordinary baby is not real. Stewie's British accent has its own unresolved origin story. McFarlane designed it for the character because it suited the villain archetype he was constructing. But within the logic of the show's world, where does Stewie's accent come from? Every member of his immediate family speaks in American accents. One fan theory worth noting proposes that Lois originally had a British accent that she deliberately suppressed at some point in her past in order to fit into a social environment where it would have marked her as an outsider. Stewie absorbed his mother's original accent during his development in the womb, which is not as far-fetched as it might sound since infant hearing begins to develop before birth, and children do absorb linguistic patterns from their primary caregiver very early. The theory has the satisfaction of a small, elegant explanation that does not require anything outside the show's existing internal logic. The show's own writers acknowledge the inconsistency around Stewie's speech in a meta-comedic way, in at least one episode where Brian and Stewie discuss which characters can and cannot understand him, treating the ambiguity as something to be acknowledged without being resolved. This kind of self-aware acknowledgement of the show's own rules without committing to following them is characteristic of Family Guy's relationship with its own internal logic, which functions more like a suggestion than a binding constraint. What the inconsistency opens up is the possibility that the ambiguity is not accidental but functional. A show that committed fully to either option, that Stewie is always heard or that he is almost never heard, would close off certain comedic and storytelling possibilities. The perpetual soft uncertainty allows the writers to use whichever version of the rule serves a given scene or a given episode without the audience holding them accountable for the contradiction, at least not within the experience of watching the episode. It is a narrative loophole that has been maintained, arguably, because it is useful. The broader question of what Stewie is, beyond simply a precocious baby, has generated its own collection of theories. The theory that he might be a height-challenged adult playing a baby character within a show structure, drawing on the canonical evidence of the Inside Family Guy episode, has the appeal of explaining his sophisticated behavior without recourse to supernatural infant intelligence. The theory that he is genuinely what he appears to be, an infant of extraordinary cognitive capacity whose precocity the family interprets as advanced babbling, preserves the show's original absurdist premise, but requires accepting the most fundamentally implausible element of the show's world as literal. What made early Stewie so compelling, and what the show gradually moved away from, was precisely this unresolved quality. He was dangerous. He was unpredictable. You never quite knew what he was going to do or say next, because his behavior was genuinely not constrained by what you expected from a character of his apparent type. The later, softer Stewie is more comfortable to spend time with and capable of genuine emotional depth. But something was lost in the transition. The original version of the character was one of a kind, and the one-of-a-kind quality was inseparable from the strangeness and the menace. Section 5. The Buried Secrets, Hidden Details, and Easter Eggs. There is a specific pleasure in watching something carefully enough to notice what was not meant to be immediately obvious, to find the detail that rewards attention in a way that the inattentive viewer will simply never encounter. Family Guy is considerably richer in this kind of layered content than most people realize, even viewers who have spent significant time with the show. The writers and animators built things into their work at multiple levels simultaneously, and the deeper levels have been accumulating context and meaning across 25 years of production. Some of the most interesting Easter eggs in the show connect directly to Seth MacFarlane's own career trajectory and his relationship with the network that aired his creation. Before Family Guy existed, MacFarlane pitched a different animated series to Fox. The show was called Gumball 2 Gumball, and it centered on Bryant Gumball, the longtime morning news anchor. The concept did not make it to air. Fox passed on the pitch, declined the idea, and moved on. MacFarlane got his revenge in the most MacFarlane way possible, which is to say quietly and with a straight face. Gumball 2 Gumball appears as a fictional television show within the world of Family Guy, mentioned in cutaway gags and referenced as background entertainment in the Griffins universe, as though it is simply another program that exists in their world. If you are watching the show and that name appears on screen, you are seeing MacFarlane essentially acknowledging and gently mocking a rejection, folding his professional biography into the texture of his own show. It is the kind of joke that rewards people who know the backstory and is completely invisible to everyone else. The DVDs of Family Guy's early seasons contain hidden content that a significant number of viewers have never found because it requires specific navigation to locate. On the special features menus of the first season DVD, moving the cursor to a specific position between character images on the menu screen produces a set of unusual symbols. Selecting those symbols unlocks additional content that the production team placed specifically for viewers willing to look closely enough. DVD Easter eggs were a fairly common practice in the early years of the format, when studios were still figuring out how to make the medium interesting, beyond the basic function of delivering a movie or television show. Family Guy's hidden content went beyond most comparable productions in its elaborateness. The newspaper and television broadcast headlines that appear throughout the show are perhaps the most consistently rewarding hidden content for the detail-oriented viewer. The show's writers understood early on that a portion of their audience would use pause functions on DVDs and later on streaming services to examine background content that flashed by too quickly to read in normal playback. They responded to this by populating those background details with jokes written specifically for the pausing viewer. One of the most frequently cited examples of this practice appears in an episode where the Griffins win a boat race and their victory is featured in the local newspaper. The headline about the race victory is visible without stopping the episode. A secondary headline at the bottom of the newspaper page, readable only if you pause the episode and look at the lower portion of the frame, reads, "DVDs paused for headline joke? Millions disappointed." The writers made a joke about the exact behavior they are exploiting to deliver the joke. The loop closes on itself perfectly. The show within the show contains a remarkable amount of layered continuity in its background details for those who are paying close attention. While the main story occupies the center of the screen, background televisions, newspapers, and other environmental details are sometimes used to develop running gags, insert references that acknowledge other shows in the MacFarlane universe, or quietly establish information that technically counts as continuity but that most viewers will never register. American Dad characters have appeared in Family Guy crowd scenes with enough regularity over the years that the shared universe of the two shows feels lived in rather than merely declared. The episode Blue Harvest, Family Guy's retelling of the original 1977 Star Wars film from the Griffin family's perspective, contains one of the show's most lovingly constructed title jokes, one that is entirely invisible unless you know a specific piece of Star Wars production history. Blue Harvest was the fake working title that George Lucas used on the actual production of Return of the Jedi in 1983, designed to prevent the enormous attention that a Star Wars production would attract from fans and journalists. The crew of Return of the Jedi wore Blue Harvest shirts, and the production operated under that name throughout filming. Family Guy chose this name for its Star Wars special, which is on the surface just a Star Wars reference. But it functions as a deeper joke for viewers who know the source, because the episode itself is doing exactly what that original cover title did, presenting a very familiar story under an alternate label that obscures what the production actually is. The joke mirrors its own reference in a way that rewards the specific knowledge required to see it. The recurring presence of what fans have come to call Holden Caulfield, an unnamed character who appears in multiple unrelated episodes to confront Peter about being a phony, is one of the show's most sustained and least explained background jokes. The character, who carries no official name in the production materials, appears across many seasons in different contexts and consistently performs the same function, interrupting whatever Peter is doing to insist loudly that he is a phony. The name fans and some production staff have given him comes from J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, whose protagonist is preoccupied above all else with identifying and confronting people he considers phonies. The connection between this unnamed character and Salinger's creation is a specific literary reference embedded in a character who has no dialogue beyond his repeated accusation, who serves no narrative function but the repetition of that accusation, and who appears in the show with enough regularity that his presence has become its own ongoing joke. He is a piece of literary Easter egg that rewards viewers with enough literary knowledge to make the connection. The Simpsons crossover episode from 2014, officially the first 2 episodes of Family Guy's 13th season and titled The Simpsons Guy, is essentially constructed as a series of layered jokes about the relationship between the two shows, both on-screen as depicted in the episode and off-screen as a comment on how the shows have coexisted in the animation landscape. The fight between Peter and Homer, which takes the form of an extended version of Family Guy's recurring Peter versus the giant chicken battle sequence, is deliberately structured to reveal something about how the shows see themselves relative to each other. Homer throws Emmy Awards at Peter during the fight, a pointed acknowledgement of the critical and award recognition that The Simpsons has accumulated. Peter has nothing equivalent to throw back with, which is the show's honest self-assessment of its own critical standing. The brief appearance and immediate departure of Roger the alien from American Dad in that same episode is a commentary on that show's changed relationship with Fox at the time of the crossover. Roger arrives, surveys the scene, and leaves quickly without engaging further. His exit references the fact that American Dad had been moved from Fox to TBS, separating it from the network context that Family Guy continued to inhabit. Even in a single wordless gag, the show was encoding information about its own institutional situation. The license plate visible on Jesus' car during a cutaway, about a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, reads WWID, a revision of the familiar religious acronym WWJD, or What Would Jesus Do?, reframed as What Would I Do from the perspective of Jesus sitting in his own vehicle. The joke lasts on screen for approximately 2 seconds. The writers put it there anyway, for the viewers who would pause to look. Background Easter eggs in the show have also occasionally documented specific internal moments in Family Guy's production history. The name of at least one real producer connected to the show was embedded in visible text within one of the show's episodes in a way that functioned as an acknowledgement of their contribution. This practice of hiding crew member names and references in background details is not unique to Family Guy, but the show did it with enough regularity and enough care that it became part of how the production team communicated appreciation for the people involved in making the show at a level of the production that the audience was almost never meant to see. In the episode Back to the Pilot, which sent Brian and Stewie back to the events of Family Guy's first episode via time travel, the show included a joke showing the characters from the pilot standing in place doing nothing while a cutaway gag played out around them. The implication was that characters simply cease to exist or suspend animation during cutaway sequences, waiting with nothing to do until the cutaway concludes and the episode resumes. This is funny as a meta-observation about the show's own structure. It is also, if you press on it, a suggestion that the show's world has no consistent existence independent of the narrative moments the camera chooses to observe, which connects back to the larger question of what kind of reality the Griffins actually inhabit. Section 6. Predictions from Nowhere. The eerie times Family Guy saw the future. There is something genuinely unsettling about a joke that turns out not to be a joke. Family Guy has generated thousands of gags over its run, and the overwhelming majority of them are exactly what they appear to be: absurdist comedy with no connection to anything that will later materialize in the real world. But a small and troubling collection of moments from the show's history lines up with subsequent real-world events with an accuracy that is uncomfortable in retrospect, in ways that do not have entirely clean explanations. Some of these apparent predictions are loose enough that they require a generous reading to see the connection, coincidences that become apparent connections mainly because pattern recognition is something that human minds do, whether or not the patterns are actually there. Others are specific enough that the explanation of pure coincidence starts to feel somewhat inadequate, not because a supernatural alternative is more credible, but because the specificity is hard to attribute entirely to random chance. The most likely accounting for all of these cases involves some combination of satire anticipating logical outcomes of trends that were already visible, industry gossip, and open secrets that were more widely known among entertainment insiders than they were in the public record, and the simple statistical reality that when you produce thousands of jokes about celebrities and current events across 25 years, a certain percentage of those jokes will eventually resemble things that happen. But knowing all of that does not make encountering specific cases feel less strange. The Kevin Spacey situation is probably the most widely cited example of the phenomenon. In a Season 4 episode that aired in 2005, Stewie accepts a bet from Brian to perform a dare. The dare involves streaking through a shopping mall, and as Stewie runs through the mall naked, he screams that he has just escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. In 2005, this was a piece of absurdist comedy that derived its effect from attaching a recognizable celebrity name to an extreme and surreal situation. The choice of Kevin Spacey rather than some other celebrity seemed, from the outside, arbitrary. In 2017, 12 years after the episode aired, the actor Anthony Rapp came forward with allegations that Kevin Spacey had made sexual advances toward him in 1986, when Rapp was 14 years old. The allegation set off a chain of additional accounts from multiple individuals who had encountered Spacey. His career was effectively ended in the weeks that followed. The episode from 2005, now being watched by people who knew what had subsequently emerged, felt different. It was no longer arbitrary that Spacey had been the target of that specific kind of joke. The most credible explanation for why the show chose Kevin Spacey for that particular gag is that information which eventually became public knowledge had been circulating in certain entertainment industry circles for years before it became a news story. Writers working in Hollywood in the early 2000s had access to rumors and gossip that existed as widely known open secrets among people in the industry, while remaining invisible to the general public. The targeting of Spacey specifically for a joke of that particular character in 2005 suggests that the writers were drawing on something they had encountered in that informal information network, rather than making a genuinely random choice. The Robin Williams coincidence operates differently and has a more affecting quality to it, precisely because it is harder to attribute to anything but terrible timing. Family Guy produced an episode in which Peter develops a supernatural ability to transform everything he touches into a character that Robin Williams had played. Williams's characters accumulate around Peter until they are everywhere, overwhelming his everyday life. The episode eventually depicts Peter attempting to end his own existence to stop the proliferation of Williams' characters, though these attempts fail in comedic ways. The episode was part of a viewing marathon of Family Guy episodes on BBC Three in the United Kingdom in August 2014. On the 11th of August 2014, Robin Williams took his own life. The BBC was in the process of airing the episode, which contained a suicide-themed plot built around an episode-length tribute to Williams's career, when news of Williams's actual death began to break. The broadcaster pulled the episode from its remaining scheduled airings. There is no reading of this that involves foresight or sinister intent. It was a terrible coincidence of timing, a piece of affectionate celebrity comedy becoming something suddenly and completely different in the context of the real news coming in alongside it. The Boston Marathon episode represents the most uncomfortable case in this category because it involves real deaths and injuries, and because the timing was close enough that the show's creators themselves seemed to have been genuinely affected by it. The episode Turban Cowboy aired on the 17th of March 2013. Its plot involved Peter befriending a man who turned out to be a terrorist. The episode also contained a specific cutaway gag in which Peter wins the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of runners, killing multiple people as he reaches the finish line. On the 15th of April 2013, approximately 1 month after the episode aired, 2 bombs were detonated near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. 3 people died. Over 260 were injured. The combination of the terrorist-related plot and the specific visual of mass casualties in connection with the Boston Marathon made the episode impossible to continue airing. Fox pulled it. Adult Swim removed it. It did not return to streaming availability until September of 2022, nearly a decade after the attacks. Seth MacFarlane, who has defended the show's most controversial content in essentially every other context, expressed something approaching genuine regret about the existence and timing of the Boston Marathon material. This is worth noting because MacFarlane almost never expresses regret about anything Family Guy has made. The Caitlyn Jenner situation from 2009 belongs in this collection with some qualification. A Family Guy episode that year included Stewie expressing puzzlement that Brody Jenner could have been born to a person then publicly known as Bruce Jenner, framing the joke in a way that treated certain aspects of that identity as surprising. Caitlyn Jenner publicly came out as a transgender woman in 2015, 6 years after the episode aired. Whether this constitutes prediction, drawing on industry knowledge about something that was apparently discussed in certain circles before it became public, or simply a joke that aged in an unexpected direction, is genuinely ambiguous. The Brett Ratner episode is somewhat less discussed but follows the same general pattern. A 2012 Family Guy episode included Brett Ratner, the film director, in a scene depicting an auction of underage girls, a darkly specific piece of comedy at his expense. In 2017, multiple women came forward with allegations of sexual harassment and assault against Ratner, and he effectively stepped back from his career in the aftermath. As with other cases in this collection, the specific choice of target for a joke of that particular character suggests that the writers were working from an informal awareness of something that had not yet become public. The broader pattern in these cases is worth examining carefully and without overstating. Family Guy's writers had access to Hollywood's informal information economy. They made jokes about real public figures over 25 years. A subset of those figures were people about whom uncomfortable truths later emerged. The convergence of those facts means that some percentage of the show's celebrity humor was going to look prescient in retrospect. The specific cases feel strange and significant, partly because our minds are designed to find patterns and to weight confirming instances heavily against the many more instances where the show's humor about celebrities produced no such retrospective resonance. None of this requires a mystical explanation, but it does suggest something interesting about the relationship between satire and the informal knowledge systems of any specific industry. Jokes that appear random from the outside sometimes draw on information that was already present in the room, in a form that was not yet suitable for public reporting, but that the people in the room already knew. There is one more case in this category that deserves mention, and it involves the show's relationship with its own creator's near-death experience. Several episodes of Family Guy have contained jokes about the events of September 11th, most famously the episode Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie visit the first episode and interact with its cruder animation. That episode contained a scene in which Stewie, aware of the events of September 11th that are about to occur, grapples with the ethical question of whether he should warn people. The episode handled the material with its characteristic approach, acknowledging the gravity of the actual events while finding specific comedic angles that were distinct from the tragedy itself. The presence of MacFarlane in that episode as the voice of multiple characters, creating comedy out of the proximity he had to those events on that actual morning, is one of the more genuinely strange loops in the show's history. Section 7. The Band and the Buried Episodes. Fox didn't want you to see. The relationship between Family Guy and the network that aired it was never simple. Fox's Standards and Practices Division, the internal body responsible for ensuring that broadcast content met the Federal Communications Commission's requirements and Fox's own policies, existed in a perpetual negotiation with a show that was built on the premise of transgressing precisely those boundaries. The financial relationship between the network and the show created its own kind of pressure in both directions, Fox needing the show's commercial performance and the show needing Fox's broadcast infrastructure. The result was a 25-year argument conducted partly in public and partly through internal revision processes that most viewers never saw. The first significant collision between Family Guy and Fox's censors came in the second season with an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The episode featured Peter seeking out a Jewish financial advisor, based on a stereotype about Jewish people and financial aptitude. The show's approach to this premise was satirical in intent, using Peter's credulous embrace of the stereotype to expose the stereotype's absurdity. Fox's Standards Division determined that the episode could be interpreted as promoting anti-Semitic ideas rather than satirizing them and refused to allow it to air. MacFarlane pushed back with characteristic public-mindedness. He organized a live table reading of the episode in front of an audience in Hollywood, staging the script as a performance that demonstrated his conviction about the episode's satirical intent. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim's Cartoon Network block in November of 2003 and appeared on the Season 3 DVD release. Fox eventually broadcast it on their own network in December 2004, roughly 2 years after it was originally supposed to air. The delay changed nothing about the episode itself, but made the experience of watching it for the first time different from what it would have been on its original intended broadcast date. The most absolute case of domestic censorship in the show's entire history is Partial Terms of Endearment, the 21st episode of Season 8, which aired in other countries but has never been broadcast on American television. The episode was written by longtime Family Guy writer Danny Smith, who had been with the show since its original writing team and who had a significant history with the show's more controversial material. In Partial Terms of Endearment, Lois agrees to serve as a surrogate mother for an old friend from her college years and the friend's partner. The friend and her partner are killed in an accident during the pregnancy, and Lois must decide whether to continue carrying the child or to terminate the pregnancy. The episode presented the arguments on both sides of the abortion question, with a degree of genuine engagement that was atypical for a show that usually handled sensitive subjects through the bluntest available comic instrument. It concluded with a joke that simultaneously refused to take a definitive position and acknowledged the artificiality of the entire premise. Fox refused to air the episode. The network also asked Adult Swim not to broadcast it, making the intervention more comprehensive than the network's usual practice of simply declining to air something on their own channel. The episode appeared on the Season 8 DVD release, including within the United States. BBC Three aired it in June 2010, but it has never been on American broadcast television, never been available on Hulu despite that platform being the primary American streaming home for Family Guy, and remains technically the only episode of the show's run to have been banned from American domestic broadcast. The inconsistency between what Fox censored and what it allowed to continue is a recurring subject in discussions about the show's censorship history. The show depicted graphic violence with considerable regularity across its run. It featured Glenn Quagmire as a recurring character whose defining personality trait was sexual predation toward women, played as comedy. It routinely presented Meg Griffin as a target of sustained abuse. It pushed into territory involving harm to children and other extreme content in ways that generated FCC complaints and advertiser inquiries on a fairly regular basis. None of this produced a domestic broadcast ban. An episode that engaged with the ethics of abortion with genuine care and a satirical framework was deemed too dangerous to air. This distinction reveals something about where American broadcast television in the early 21st century drew its content lines. Violence, even graphic violence, was more acceptable than serious engagement with contested social questions. The cultural politics of abortion in particular were treated by Fox as too volatile to handle, regardless of the sophistication with which a specific piece of content addressed the subject. MacFarlane has discussed the inconsistency with frustration in various contexts over the years. The censorship of specific scenes and lines within episodes that did air is extensive and covers essentially the entire production history of the show. The differences between the Fox broadcast version, the cable network versions on channels like Adult Swim and TBS, and the DVD versions of episodes are significant and vary considerably from episode to episode. An early episode contained a scene in which Stewie performs a distraction for airport security and concludes with a joke about Osama bin Laden employing the same tactic. The scene was broadcast in its original airing, which predated the September 11th attacks. After September 11th, it was cut from reruns and from the initial DVD release, though it has since been restored in certain streaming and later physical release versions. There is also a set of scenes and lines that were modified or removed not because of sensitive subject matter, but because of specific jokes that Fox's legal or standards departments determined created liability through references to real people in ways the network wanted to avoid. The audience watching the broadcast version of any given Family Guy episode has always been watching a version of the episode that had already been through this revision process, not the version as the writers originally assembled it. The Venezuelan diplomatic incident connected to the Season 7 episode 420, represents a genuinely extraordinary example of Family Guy-related censorship that operated entirely outside the American regulatory framework. Venezuela's justice minister objected to the episode's content about marijuana legalization and issued warnings to cable broadcasters in Venezuela that they would face financial penalties for continuing to air the show. Family Guy, an American animated comedy about a fictional Rhode Island family, had triggered a formal response from a foreign government's law enforcement infrastructure. Whatever you think about the episode itself, or about the Venezuelan government's response to it, the fact that this happened is a specific and remarkable entry in the show's history. The PTV episode, which the show conceived as a satirical treatment of broadcast censorship itself, achieved the somewhat ironic result of being subject to censorship on its way to broadcast. The episode was made to mock the wave of FCC indecency enforcement that followed the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show incident. The episode contained a scene involving Peter and a highway overpass that was removed entirely from the broadcast version at the censor's request. The production team chose complete removal over modification. The DVD version retains the scene. The show made about censorship was censored. There is also the matter of Disney Plus, which became a streaming home for Family Guy as part of the Disney acquisition of Fox's entertainment assets. Disney Plus initially aired the censored broadcast versions of episodes rather than the uncensored DVD versions, a choice that created an interesting situation where a streaming platform owned by one of the world's largest entertainment companies was delivering a more restricted version of content than the physical DVDs that had been available. For years, Seasons 18 and beyond reportedly have never had official uncensored releases at all, distinction from the earlier seasons, where the DVD versions consistently included material that the broadcast versions had removed. The Conway Twitty gag deserves its own specific mention as a case study in how the absence of quality control can become its own kind of production problem. This was a recurring bit in which the show simply interrupted its narrative to show an unedited performance by the late country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs. Not a brief clip, not a parodic version, an actual unedited performance lasting for extended periods of real screen time while the audience waited for the show to resume. The bit had genuine shock value the first time it appeared. The sheer unexpectedness of a comedy show stopping to air a country music performance with no setup and no punchline. The problem was that the writers deployed it multiple times. What was genuinely surprising the first time became a deliberate provocation against the audience's patience by the third or fourth use. The gag became a symbol for critics and fans of a specific kind of creative laziness that became more common in the show's later seasons. The willingness to use screen time in ways that made no comedic investment while generating no comedic return, relying on the audience's willingness to keep watching even when the show was actively testing that willingness. Whether this was MacFarlane himself approving the Conway Twitty gag's repeated use as some kind of extended experiment in audience patience, or whether it was the writing room doing something that nobody with adequate quality control authority was willing to stop, is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Section 8. The Dark Theories Fan Explanations That Change Everything. Fan theories represent a specific kind of creative exchange between an audience and the text they have committed to engaging with. They are the viewers talking back to the show, filling in its gaps, finding coherence in its contradictions, occasionally discovering meanings that the creators may not have consciously placed there, but that nonetheless illuminate something real about how the show works. The best fan theories do not just resolve a puzzle. They reframe how you see everything around the puzzle once it is resolved. Family Guy has generated a remarkable collection of theories that, if you let yourself inhabit them, fundamentally change the experience of watching the show. The multiverse theory is probably the most structurally satisfying explanation for one of the show's genuine and persistent curiosities. Anyone who has watched the show from the beginning and then returned to rewatch the earliest episodes knows that something feels distinctly different about seasons 1 through 3 compared to everything that followed the 2005 revival. The characters behave differently in ways that go beyond simple character development or growth. Meg is treated with something approaching normal parental attention by her family. Peter has genuine warmth and occasional moments of emotional clarity that feel authentic rather than token. Lois is warmer. Brian is less of a performance and more of a presence. The standard explanation is simply that the show changed its creative approach after returning from cancellation. But one fan theory offers a more interesting internal explanation. In the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to visit the events of the show's original premiere episode. Under this theory, what they actually visit is not a version of their own timeline's past, but a parallel universe that resembles it. When they return to the present, they return to their own universe, which has always been different from the one depicted in the original 3 seasons. Under this framework, the Family Guy we watch after the 2005 revival exists in a different reality from the one depicted in seasons 1 through 3. The characters are genuinely distinct individuals who happen to share names and physical appearances with their counterparts. The emotional register difference is not artistic inconsistency but accurate portrayal of alternate timeline people constituted differently. The existence of Road to the Multiverse and multiple other episodes that establish parallel universes as genuine features of the show's cosmology gives this theory structural support that cannot be dismissed as baseless. The theory that Brian Griffin is the author of Family Guy is another one that accumulates specific evidence the more carefully you examine it. In this reading, Brian is not just a character in the show, but its creator in a more literal sense, the writer of an exaggerated, fictionalized account of life with the Griffin family. This explains several things simultaneously. Brian appears in essentially every episode of Family Guy, including episodes where his presence is not required by any obvious narrative logic. He is the most articulate and self-aware character in the household. His commentary on events shapes how we experience them, even when the camera is ostensibly on someone else. The theory also provides a framework for understanding Brian's character deterioration over the course of the show's run. Under this reading, the increasingly insufferable and morally compromised Brian of later seasons is not a character who genuinely became worse as a person. He is a character whose author began using him more and more as a self-insertion, allowing his own worst qualities to surface through the cover of fiction. Brian's political speeches became more frequent and less dramatically earned as the seasons continued because MacFarlane, mediated through Brian's authorship, was becoming increasingly willing to use his character as a platform for his own views. Brian's serial failures as a writer, the unfinished novel, the self-help book that succeeds commercially despite being hollow, the television pilot that gets canceled, are the author processing his own complicated feelings about his work through fictionalized versions of his own struggles. The darkest reading of the show involves a catastrophic backstory for Peter Griffin that predates everything we see on screen. This theory, which has been developed in detail by multiple independent theorists over the years, proposes that before Family Guy begins, Peter lost his family in some catastrophic way. In most versions, Meg and Chris died in a car accident. In some versions, Lois took her own life as a result. Unable to process the grief, Peter's mind constructed an elaborate protective fantasy in which everything was still intact, and the Family Guy we watch is the content of that fantasy. The increasing cruelty and erratic behavior of Peter in the later seasons becomes, under this theory, the signature of a mind under mounting strain. The fantasy Peter is maintaining is beginning to crack and distort, and the distortions express themselves as the character becoming less recognizable as a human being and more like a projection of unprocessed rage and grief. The reversal of episodes, the way significant consequences are consistently undone and everything resets, is a feature of the fantasy mechanism rather than a writing failure. A mind protecting itself from loss cannot allow the fantasy to actually progress toward resolution, because resolution might mean acknowledgement. The show within a show theory has more canonical support than most fan theories manage to accumulate. The season 15 Family Guy episode, Inside Family Guy, depicted the show explicitly as a fictional television production, with the Griffin family depicted as actors who played characters in a show and who gave documentary-style interview commentary about the experience. American Dad subsequently included a scene in which Stan Smith listed Brian Griffin as his favorite fictional dog, an acknowledgement from within American Dad that Brian and Family Guy exist as fictional constructs within American Dad's world. The implication builds a specific recursive structure. Family Guy is a television show that airs in the universe of American Dad. The Griffins are characters within that show, and the two universes are therefore related to each other as fictional and real worlds within the same shared cosmology. The alcoholism theory concerning Brian, developed independently by multiple fans, takes the character's known dependency on alcohol and extends it into a full explanatory framework for everything that went wrong with his characterization in the later seasons. The theory proposes that Brian's diminishing intelligence, increasing moral failure, and escalating self-destructive behavior over the course of the show is not a writing failure, but an accurate portrayal of what prolonged alcohol dependency does to a person's cognitive and moral functioning. Brian drinks in every season. His consumption has always been treated as a character trait and a source of humor. But under this theory, the humor is masking something real. As the seasons progress, Brian becomes measurably less intelligent. His judgment becomes more frequently and more severely impaired. His relationships become more exploitative and less genuine. His self-awareness deteriorates. These are the actual known effects of long-term alcohol abuse on the human nervous system. If Brian's arc is read as the arc of someone whose addiction has been progressively dismantling him, then the character deterioration that critics and fans have described as bad writing becomes something else entirely, an unexpectedly realistic portrait of what addiction does to a person over time. The CIA theory for Brian's origin is a smaller piece of speculation, but one that has a satisfying connection to the show's shared universe. American Dad establishes that the CIA conducts experiments involving the transfer of human consciousness into animal bodies. The primary canonical example is Klaus, the goldfish, who was originally a German Olympic athlete and had his consciousness transplanted into a fish. Given that this technology demonstrably exists in the world shared by Family Guy and American Dad, the theory that Brian Griffin is another CIA experiment, a human whose consciousness was placed in a dog's body, provides a clean explanation for his ability to speak, think at an adult level, drive a car, drink at a bar, and generally function as a person who happens to be a dog. It also explains the quality of sadness and displacement that has run through Brian's character since the earliest seasons, as someone who knows they are inhabiting the wrong body and can never fully account for why everything feels slightly wrong. There is also the theory about Peter Jr., based on a throwaway line in an episode called Lottery Fever, in which Peter tells his children that they will never be as good as their older brother who died. He says this casually, as a piece of cruelty deployed mid-conversation. Whether this references an actual dead sibling, whether the sibling was real within the show's canon, or whether Peter was simply being randomly cruel in the way he often is, has never been addressed. The implication that there was a previous child, a Peter Jr., who is gone, would add another layer to the darkness that runs through the Griffin household's history, another loss that the family carries without processing. Section 9. The Mystery of Meg, Who is Stan Thompson. There is a small moment buried in a Season 3 episode of Family Guy that functions as one of the show's most persistently unresolved mysteries, a single revelation dropped in the middle of a courtroom scene that the episode moved past and that the show proceeded to mostly ignore for years before eventually returning to it in a way that raised even more questions than the original. The episode is Screwed the Pooch. Its central plot concerns Brian fathering puppies with a pedigree dog and the subsequent legal dispute over Brian's rights to see his offspring. In a courtroom sequence, Peter is challenged to demonstrate whether he is genuinely a good and attentive father figure in order to establish whether Brian's paternity is being evaluated fairly. Peter is put to the test by Brian, who answers questions about the Griffin children that a proper, present, attentive father would know. Peter admits that he would not know these things. Brian answers them. He reaches Meg. The question about Meg is framed as the critical one, the piece of knowledge that a real father would have that distinguishes genuine attention from mere proximity. Brian's answer, delivered in the same even conversational tone with which he has answered the other questions, is that Meg's biological father is a man named Stan Thompson. The episode moves on. Meg herself is present for part of this scene but is wearing headphones and does not hear the revelation. The show deposits this information into the record and then sets it aside. The implication of Brian's answer is enormous, considered in context. Meg is not Peter's biological daughter. Lois had a relationship or encounter with another man that resulted in Meg's conception. The family knows this. Peter knows it. Brian clearly knows it. Chris and Stewie have been established in various episodes as knowing it as well. The one person who does not know is Meg, the person it most directly concerns, and the family has collectively decided, explicitly or implicitly, to maintain this secret. The decision by the family to keep Meg ignorant of her own origins adds a specific dimension to everything about how she is treated in the show. Peter already treats Meg with persistent cruelty and contempt. Knowing that he is not her biological father does not explain that cruelty, since there are plenty of stepfathers who love and care for children who are not biologically theirs. But it does add a possible secondary dimension to his behavior, the way an insecure person might project resentment toward a child that reminded them of something complicated about their relationship and their family's history. What is known about Stan Thompson from canonical sources within the show is limited but consistent with the initial revelation. He appears to have been someone in Lois's life before or during the early period of her relationship with Peter. The encounter that produced Meg seems to have been complicated enough that Stan chose not to be involved in the child's life. Multiple episodes across the show's later seasons have referenced his existence, most in the form of brief jokes or asides that acknowledge the secret without developing it, maintaining the ongoing premise that everyone in the family except Meg knows something significant about where she came from. The question of who Stan Thompson actually is, what his history with Lois was, how Peter came to know and to accept the truth about Meg's parentage while still ostensibly being her father, has been circling the show for much of its run without receiving a fully satisfying treatment. The 20th season eventually gave the character a more substantial canonical appearance through an episode that sent Meg in search of her biological father after finally learning the truth. The episode attempted to give Meg something that the show had rarely provided: a new relationship that did not position her at the bottom of someone else's social hierarchy. What the show found when it developed the Stan Thompson plot more extensively was a man whose life had its own particular disappointments and missteps, someone who had made choices he was not proud of and who encountered Meg's arrival in his life with complicated feelings. The episode attempted to give Meg something the show had rarely provided: a new relationship built on genuine connection rather than existing hierarchy. Whether this development sustained into subsequent episodes or was reset by the show's institutional resistance to allowing its characters to genuinely change is a question that the show's own reset tendencies make difficult to answer with confidence. The broader context of Meg's birth has been revisited across the show's run in ways that are consistently inconsistent. Multiple episodes have presented different and incompatible accounts of how Meg came to exist and how she was received at birth. In one episode, she is born with her heart on top of her head, explaining the hat she perpetually wears. In another, Peter changes her name to Megatron Griffin on her birth certificate. In the episode that depicted Peter and Lois attempting to leave infant Meg at a fire station, the joke framed their effort to abandon her as a fond, shared memory between the two parents. The accumulation of these birth-related gags creates a picture of a character who was not wanted before she was born and was not fully accepted after. The Stan Thompson revelation layers biological parentage questions on top of this already fraught foundation. Meg came into the world as the result of something Lois might prefer not to think about, carried to term by parents who were ambivalent about her existence, and has spent her subsequent life in a family that has generally treated her as an imposition rather than a person. What makes this worth dwelling on rather than treating it as simply a collection of cruel jokes is that the show has demonstrated, in specific moments scattered across its run, that it understands who Meg actually is. The episodes where she demonstrates real resilience, the brief period where she began fighting back against her tormentors, the crossover episode where Lisa Simpson recognized her talent and intelligence, the episode where her father's history of abuse was used to explain rather than excuse the cycle she has been caught in, all of these showed a version of Meg that is considerably more interesting than the punching bag that the majority of the show treated her as. The Stan Thompson mystery matters not just as a narrative puzzle, but as a window into what the show chose to do with one of its central characters. Meg had been given a secret history rich enough to fuel years of meaningful story. The secret had been planted in Season 3 and was available for development at any point. The show mostly chose not to develop it, preferring to leave Meg in the position the joke required rather than pursuing what the character might have become if the mystery had been treated as the beginning of something rather than as a throwaway reveal. The parallel between Meg's situation and Peter's own family history adds another layer worth considering. In a later season, Peter discovers that his own father is not the man who raised him, that his biological father was an Irish man who got his mother pregnant and then was absent from Peter's life. Peter's response to this discovery is to pursue a relationship with his biological father, to feel the pull of that connection even after a lifetime without it. The show allowed Peter to have that story while simultaneously keeping Meg's equivalent story largely inaccessible to her for most of the show's run. The asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects the different values the show assigned to these two characters across its history. There are also smaller mysteries nested within the larger Stan Thompson question. What exactly was the nature of Lois's relationship with him? The show has implied different things at different points, sometimes suggesting it was a brief encounter during a period of confusion in her relationship with Peter, sometimes implying something more sustained. The timeline of how Meg came to be, and specifically what Lois and Peter's relationship looked like at that point, has never been made fully clear. Whether Peter knew about the situation before or after Meg's birth, and what he was told and how he processed it, is information the show has withheld. The show does establish in the Stan Thompson episodes that everyone in the family knows the secret. This means Peter has been carrying this knowledge for Meg's entire life. His relationship with Meg, his treatment of her across the show's run, takes on a different character when you consider that he has always known she is not biologically his, and has chosen to express that knowledge through contempt rather than through the warmth he might have extended to a child who genuinely needed it. The revelation does not make Peter's behavior toward Meg more understandable. It makes it more specifically chosen, and therefore more specific in its cruelty. Section 10. The Animation Secrets. The studios behind the drawings. Family Guy does not look the same across its entire run, and understanding why requires going deeper into the production machinery of the show than most viewers have reason to look. The visual quality differences between different eras of the show are not primarily the result of evolving artistic ambition or changing aesthetic philosophy on the part of the American creative team in Los Angeles. They are the result of the work being physically produced by different animation studios in different countries at different points in the production history, each of which brought its own technical culture and visual sensibility to the material. Animation for American network television, particularly animation in the comedy space, has operated on an outsourcing model since at least the 1980s. The writing and direction happen in the United States, but the frame-by-frame drawing work is typically done by studios in South Korea, Japan, or other countries where animation production costs are substantially lower. The American studio provides the scripts, the character designs, the storyboards, and the direction. The overseas studio produces the finished animation. The two elements are then reunited in post-production. Family Guy's first season was primarily animated by a South Korean studio called Grimsame, which was a division of a larger entertainment company called Sunwoo Entertainment. Grimsame had worked on a range of American animation productions and brought workmanlike competence to the first 15 Family Guy episodes. The first season animation has a specific quality that is different from what followed. A roughness at the edges that reflects both the production's small budget and the fact that the character models were still being refined and standardized in real time as the season proceeded. Starting in the second season, the production began distributing its work across multiple studios in rotation, with Rough Draft Studios taking an increasingly significant role. Rough Draft was based in Glendale, California, and operated a production branch in South Korea that did most of the actual drawing work. The studio had accumulated a strong reputation in American animation circles through their work on Futurama, the Matt Groening science fiction comedy that was running concurrently with Family Guy on Fox. Their Futurama work demonstrated that they could maintain character model consistency across a long production run while still achieving genuine expressiveness in the finished animation. The rough draft seasons of Family Guy, which covered primarily the second season through portions of the sixth, are generally identified by animation enthusiasts as the era when the show looked its best. The characters moved with more fluid energy than in the first season or in what followed. Facial expressions were sharper and carried more emotional information. The physical comedy in those episodes benefited from animation that was working in concert with the timing rather than at cross purposes with it. When Peter fell downstairs or collided with something, or the giant chicken fight sequences went through their elaborate choreography, the rough draft animation gave these moments the kind of physical expressiveness that made them funnier than the same scene would have been with inferior animation. Why does animation quality matter specifically for comedy? Because comedy is fundamentally about timing, and timing is not purely a product of writing and dialogue. It is also a product of how images move and how quickly they move, and what the movement communicates emotionally. A character delivering a punchline with perfect vocal timing can still have the joke undercut if the animation of the face does not match the emotional beat of the line. Physical comedy requires animation that understands how exaggerated physical movement generates humor, when to hold a moment and when to snap out of it, how to time an impact for maximum comedic effect. The rough draft era animation understood these things. The work that replaced it understood them less. Digital Emation, another South Korean studio, became the dominant production house for Family Guy, starting around the 6th and 7th seasons, and eventually became essentially the sole studio handling the main body of the show's animation. Digital Emation's Family Guy work is characterized by a visual quality that fans and critics have consistently described as stiffer and more rigid than the rough draft era. The characters' movements are more restricted. The expressions are less nuanced. The outlines became heavier in ways that affected how the characters read on screen. The shift to digital production tools also changed something about the texture of the animation. The early Family Guy seasons were produced in ways that retained some of the quality of traditional hand-drawn animation, a certain organic variability in the line work and a slightly tactile quality to the images. Later seasons produced using more standardized digital workflows have a smoother and more uniform appearance that is technically more consistent, but feels less alive in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely but immediately apparent in direct comparison. The production timeline of each Family Guy episode is itself a significant piece of information about the show's relationship with its own content. Each episode takes approximately 10 months from initial concept to finished broadcast product. The process begins in the writer's room, where ideas are pitched and developed through multiple rounds of discussion and revision before becoming formal scripts. Those scripts are then translated into storyboards by visual development artists, and the boards are sent overseas to the animation studio. The animation is produced, returned, edited together with voice recordings that were completed months earlier, scored with music, and prepared for broadcast. 10 months between concept and broadcast means that Family Guy cannot be topical in the way that live comedy can be topical. By the time an episode addressing a specific news story or current event reaches its broadcast date, the specific circumstances the writers were responding to may have changed substantially or been forgotten entirely. This explains the show's tendency to favor cultural references with longer shelf lives over immediate news events, to build comedy around films and music and celebrity personas that remain culturally relevant across the time frame of the production pipeline. Walter Murphy composed the music for Family Guy's pilot and has scored every episode since the beginning of the show's run in 1999. Murphy brought a musical sensibility to the show that was more sophisticated than animation scores typically received at that time. He used orchestral techniques and harmonic choices that added depth and emotional texture to scenes that might otherwise have been undersupported sonically. The show's theme song, written by McFarlane and performed in a style deliberately evoking the big band variety show aesthetics of mid-20th century American television entertainment, was both a specific musical choice and a kind of tonal statement about what kind of show Family Guy was positioning itself as. A contemporary comedy that acknowledged its lineage in older American television traditions, even while its content was far more transgressive than anything those traditions could have accommodated. The giant chicken fight sequences that recur throughout the show are a production challenge unto themselves. The fights, which pit Peter against an enormous chicken in increasingly elaborate, physics-defying battles that go on for several minutes, require detailed storyboarding and choreography that is far more complex than the standard Family Guy animation workflow. They have become one of the show's most distinctive recurring elements, beloved by a large segment of the audience, and each new iteration is treated as an event. The 2024 announcement that the giant chicken had died, made by the show's executive producers as the giant chicken's voice actor also passed away, was presented as genuine news and generated significant fan response. What had begun as an absurdist running gag started in Season 2 when Peter and a chicken got into a fight over an expired coupon, had accumulated enough emotional weight over decades that its apparent conclusion felt like an actual loss. The animation differences between the show's various eras have become a specific subject of interest among the community of viewers who have engaged deeply with the show over the years. There are dedicated discussions about which studio handled which episodes, which seasons represent which visual approaches, and how the production infrastructure changes correlate with the creative changes that were happening in the show at the same time. The viewers who participate in these discussions are engaging with Family Guy at a level of technical and historical detail that the show itself never anticipated or designed for. Section 11. The Writing Room Secrets. What really happened behind closed doors. Television shows are made in rooms. Everything that eventually reaches the screen, every joke, every character beat, every piece of story, every decision about what goes too far and what does not go far enough, begins as a conversation around a table. Understanding what went on in Family Guy's writing room across 25 years of production gives you more insight into why the show is what it is than almost any other single piece of information. The original writing team that MacFarlane assembled for Family Guy was small and creatively cohesive. The core group who built the show's foundation included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. This was a group with shared sensibilities, assembled to serve a specific creative vision, working in close collaboration with MacFarlane as they developed the show's voice and language. When the early seasons worked, it was because this particular combination of people, in constant communication, had found a way to build something coherent and funny together. The cancellation cycle destroyed this original cohesion in ways that had lasting consequences. When the show was canceled and then briefly revived and then canceled again, the writers faced career decisions that a stable production would not have imposed on them. Some stayed through loyalty or genuine belief that the show would return. Others accepted other employment because they could not realistically wait on a show that might never come back. Neil Goldman and Garrett Donovan went on to spend 8 years writing for Scrubs, the medical comedy on NBC, eventually becoming executive producers. Their contributions to Scrubs were substantial and critically well received, suggesting that the sensibilities they had developed in Family Guy's early writing room were genuinely transferable to a very different comedic context. Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman did something more consequential for the history of animated comedy. They left Family Guy to become co-creators of American Dad, taking a significant portion of the creative DNA that had shaped Family Guy's original identity and transplanting it into a different project. The divergence of American Dad from Family Guy over time is one of the more interesting things that happened in American television animation in the 21st century, and its story begins in this writing room departure. Barker and Weitzman took the structural discipline that had made Family Guy's early seasons work, the commitment to actual storytelling, the resistance to letting cutaways replace narrative, the care about character consistency, and applied it to the new show they were building. American Dad also benefited from not having any accumulated baggage. It could establish its rules and hold to them without the complications of a prior identity that was being partially preserved and partially abandoned. The practice of pitching cutaway gags separately from main storylines and selecting them based on their quality as standalone jokes rather than their relationship to the specific episode in which they would appear is one of the most important structural facts about how Family Guy was made. The writer's room does not only produce complete episodes, it also produces gag pitches, individual joke concepts that are offered up and evaluated on their own terms. The strongest gags from this ongoing pitch process get inserted into episodes as cutaways. This system has a certain practical elegance. It means the show has a constantly refreshing pool of comedic material to draw from. It allows individual writers to contribute specific jokes to episodes they did not primarily write, but it also means that the show's comedic center of gravity is pulled toward the standalone moment rather than the sustained narrative. When the main story in an episode is strong, the separately sourced cutaways feel like bonuses. When the main story is weak, the cutaways feel like a replacement for what the story should have been doing, and the episode as a whole becomes a vehicle for delivering jokes rather than a piece of narrative entertainment. The showrunner transition around 2011, when MacFarlane stepped back from daily creative oversight and Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin took on the primary responsibility for the show's direction, is a documented and significant turning point. Both Appel and Sulkin were experienced professionals who knew the show intimately. But the show they inherited was not the same as the show they would have built from scratch, and the direction they took it in reflected their own priorities rather than McFarlane's original vision. The character of Meg Griffin's treatment in the writing room is a subject that has been discussed from multiple angles over the years. For roughly the period from season 4 through season 14, the Meg abuse that became one of the show's defining features was produced by a writer's room that was overwhelmingly male. The specific forms that the abuse took, the physical cruelty, the explicit wishes that she did not exist, the relentless targeting of her appearance and her social status, the episode that concluded with Meg voluntarily accepting her role as family punching bag, all of these came from a room with minimal feminine perspective on the consequences of that comedic approach. The addition of more women to the writing staff at various points in the show's later history corresponded with a moderation in the extremity of Meg's treatment. The character began to receive storylines that showed her as capable, occasionally formidable, and possessed of genuine interior life beyond her suffering. The connection between staff composition and on-screen content is not deterministic, but it is not nothing either. What changed when more women joined the room was that the instinctive check on a certain kind of humor became present in the creative process at the point where it could actually influence what made it to the screen. The relationship between Family Guy's production and the broader economic structure that sustained it became increasingly visible as the show continued into its later seasons. An animated show is substantially cheaper to produce than a live-action network drama. There are no sets to build, no on-screen talent with multi-million-dollar contracts, no location costs. The voice actors record in booths. The animation is produced overseas. The post-production process is comparatively economical. This cost structure means that an animated show can sustain itself as a commercially viable product at audience numbers that would be insufficient to justify a live-action show's continuation. Family Guy's ratings declined dramatically over the course of its run, from nearly 8 million viewers in its post-revival peak to numbers below 1 million in certain recent seasons. A live-action show operating with those audience numbers relative to its production costs would have been canceled long before reaching that point. Family Guy continued to be renewed because the economics of animation made even significantly reduced audience numbers commercially defensible. The show was cheap enough to make that it remained profitable even at a fraction of its former audience size. The renewal deal signed in April 2025, which committed to 4 more seasons and extended the show's run through the 2028 to 2029 television season and the show's 30th anniversary, was not made because the show was performing exceptionally well as a television program. It was made because Family Guy's value in syndication, on streaming platforms, in merchandise licensing, and in the overall IP ecosystem of the parent company made the economics of continuation straightforward. The business decision and the creative decision had, by this point, almost entirely decoupled. The show's writers have, throughout its run, demonstrated that they are aware of the show's problems and have occasionally commented on them directly within the episodes themselves. Characters have broken the fourth wall to acknowledge that the show has been running too long, that the writing has become lazy, that the audience's patience is being tested. Whether this kind of self-aware commentary functions as an honest acknowledgement of problems or as a way of inoculating the show against criticism by naming the criticism first is a question the show has never answered to. Everyone's satisfaction. Acknowledging that you are doing something wrong is not the same as stopping doing it. Section 12. The Legacy and the Unanswered Questions. Family Guy turned 25 years old in 2024. That number, held up against everything that the show has survived, and everything it has become, and everything it has left unresolved behind it, demands some serious consideration rather than summary dismissal or uncomplicated celebration. A quarter-century is a remarkable span of time for anything human beings make, but particularly remarkable for a television comedy that was canceled twice before finding its audience, and that has spent much of its later life generating debate about whether it should continue to exist at all. The legacy of Family Guy can be approached from several different directions simultaneously, and the view changes depending on which angle you take. From a production and industry history perspective, Family Guy did something that permanently altered how the American entertainment industry understood its relationship to its own canceled content. The show's resurrection was the clearest early proof that a passionate, committed audience could exist at significant scale for a piece of entertainment without registering meaningfully in the traditional measurement systems. The people who loved Family Guy enough to buy millions of DVDs and drive cable rerun numbers up by 239% had always been there. The industry simply had not been measuring them. After Family Guy demonstrated what their numbers actually meant in commercial terms, the industry began developing new ways to think about and count secondary and delayed viewing. The specific lesson Family Guy taught about DVD sales and cable rerun performance as indicators of audience commitment, rather than mere reflections of broadcast success, changed how networks made cancellation and renewal decisions. Not immediately and not completely, but the shift was real and traceable. Family Guy was the case study that people in the industry pointed to when making arguments about shows that deserved second chances, about audiences that existed outside the Nielsen framework, about the difference between a show's broadcast performance and its actual cultural footprint. On the creative side, Family Guy's influence on the language of adult animated comedy is visible in the DNA of everything that followed it. The cutaway gag format, which the show used more extensively than any other major comedy, became a specific structural option that subsequent animated series had to consciously position themselves relative to. Shows that chose not to use cutaways were making a deliberate decision to distinguish themselves from Family Guy's approach. Shows that used cutaways were building on a format that Family Guy had popularized. Either way, the conversation about cutaway gags in adult animation after 2005 was a conversation that Family Guy had made necessary. The show also demonstrated in practical terms that adult animated comedy could sustain itself on broadcast network television at a level of transgressive content that had previously been considered impossible for the format. The Simpsons had pioneered the basic possibility of animated comedy for adult audiences in prime time. Family Guy pushed the boundaries of what that format could contain, and finding that those boundaries were further out than the industry had assumed, created space for everything that came after. Bonnie Swanson was pregnant for 116 episodes, spanning 7 real-world years of the show's production. This is one of the show's more remarkable sustained continuity anomalies, a pregnancy that outlasted what would be anatomically possible by a factor that is not small. The explanations that have been offered for this have never fully satisfied, in part because the show never addressed the anomaly directly with the self-awareness it brought to other meta-jokes about its own inconsistencies. Mayor Adam West's transition out of the show following the death of his voice actor, Adam West, in June 2017, is another element in the show's legacy that sits somewhat unresolved. West had been a genuine presence in Family Guy since its early seasons, voicing a character that bore his own name and that drew freely on his own public persona as the actor most associated with the campy 1960s Batman television series. His death left the show with a problem it handled somewhat gingerly. The character was acknowledged to have died within the show's world rather than simply being recast or written out off-screen, which was an unusual decision and one that felt like an acknowledgement of the genuine affection the show had for the real person behind the character. A cousin character, Wild West, voiced by Sam Elliott, was eventually introduced as something of a successor, but the dynamic between a character played by the real Adam West and a successor character played by a different actor could never be fully replicated. The question of what Seth MacFarlane originally intended for Stewie's arc, and when and why those intentions changed, remains genuinely open. In early interviews and public statements from the show's first few seasons, MacFarlane described a vision for Stewie that involved eventual resolution of the character's defining premise. The evil genius baby would, in this vision, actually carry out some version of his schemes. The relationship with Lois would reach a genuine dramatic climax. None of that happened. The character was gradually softened, the evil genius premise was quietly retired, and the Season 6 two-parter that appeared to be a grand finale for that version of Stewie turned out to be a simulation that reset everything. Whether MacFarlane made this decision himself, whether it was driven by network preferences, or whether it emerged from the writers' room's collective sense that the character had developed in a different direction, is a question that has never been addressed with specificity. The show will reach its 30th anniversary in 2029. The renewal deal signed in 2025 commits to taking Family Guy through that milestone with new episodes. Whatever the show looks like by then, Whatever questions it has answered in the intervening years and whatever new ones it has introduced, the core story remains one of the more interesting things that has happened in American television. A young animator from Connecticut made a 15-minute pilot with $50,000 and his own drawing hand. The pilot became a show that aired after the Super Bowl to 22 million viewers. The show was canceled. It came back. It was canceled again. DVD sales and late-night cable reruns resurrected it in ways the industry had never seen. It returned and ran for 20 more years and generated banned episodes and diplomatic incidents and fan theories that have been seriously engaged with by millions of people. It survived the departure of the person who built it. It outlasted the creative ecosystem that made its best moments possible. It kept going because it was cheap to produce and valuable in licensing terms. And somewhere inside all of that machinery, there are still mysteries. Still the question of who can hear Stewie in any given moment, and why the answer keeps changing. Still the unresolved shadow of Stan Thompson in Meg's history, the biological father who appeared and disappeared over 20-plus seasons without the show ever fully committing to what his existence meant. Still the question of what Brian Griffin actually is and where his intelligence came from. Still the fan theories that propose alternative readings of everything the show has done that suggest the whole mess might be a fantasy or a fiction within a fiction, or a story told by a character who is also its author. Family Guy is a show that has been watched by enormous numbers of people for over 25 years, and it is still not fully understood. That might be the strangest and most interesting thing about it. The show is messy and inconsistent and sometimes mean and often lazy and occasionally, in specific scattered moments, genuinely remarkable in ways that justify everything that came before and around them. The Brian and Stewie episode, the two characters locked in a vault talking honestly about their lives and their fears, no cutaways, no gags, just character and dialogue. The early Peter and Lois relationship, before it curdled into something more combative. The original Stewie, that terrifying perfect absurdity of a baby in a diaper planning the end of civilization between meals. These things were real. They happened. They are part of what the show is. What the show is also all the other things. The inconsistency. The mysteries that were placed there and then forgotten. The predictions that turned out to be something else. The banned episodes and the modified scenes and the diplomatic incidents and the 25 years of people pausing their screens to read background headlines written specifically for them. The Griffins are still on Spooner Street. Peter still has his bar and his friends and his inexplicable capacity to survive everything he encounters. Brian still has his martinis and his unfinished manuscript and his complicated relationship with who he has become. Stewie still has his room and his time machine and whatever plans he may or may not be currently developing, depending on which version of him you happen to be watching. Meg still exists within this family and still carries the weight of everything the show put on her, and also the weight of the secret about who she actually is that she may or may not still carry depending on which episode you happen to be watching. The show turns 30 in 2029. It will be different from the show that started in 1999, because everything is different from what it started as after 30 years. But the questions that run through it, the things that resist resolution, the mysteries that the show introduced and then lived with rather than answering, will still be there. They will have been accumulating context for 30 years by then, and the accumulation will have made them richer rather than simpler. That is what good mysteries do. They age well. They become more interesting with time rather than less. Family Guy, for all of its imperfections and all of its inconsistencies and all of the things it could have been and chose not to be, has a collection of mysteries that are worth sitting with in the dark, late at night, while the episodes play and the Griffins do the things they do. The show is not finished. The questions are not finished. And somewhere in that particular combination of incompletion, there is something worth staying up for. Thank you for staying all the way to the end of this one. That genuinely means something. If this is the kind of content you want more of, subscribing is the single best thing you can do to make that happen. It is free and it takes 5 seconds and it makes a real difference. Drop a comment. Tell me what you thought. Tell me which mystery interested you the most. Tell me if there is something you think should have been included. Until next time, stay curious, stay comfortable, and we will see you in the next one. End of script. Quagmire, the character the show never fully reckoned with. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most interesting and most problematic characters in Family Guy's history, And the way the show handled him across 25 years reveals something specific about the tensions built into the show's fundamental approach to comedy. Quagmire was created as a type that existed in a specific tradition of American male comedy, the compulsive sexual pursuer whose relentless and indiscriminate approach to women is framed as both his defining characteristic and the primary source of his comedy. The character was voiced by MacFarlane, who gave him a vocal personality that oscillated between a jet pilot smoothness, lifted from mid-century entertainment culture, and a barely suppressed frenzy that broke through in his catchphrase, and in the escalating energy of his pursuit scenes. In the early seasons, Quagmire's behavior was exaggerated enough to function as parody. He was not presented as a realistic portrait of sexual predation, but as a cartoon grotesque, the specific human type of the relentless pursuer taken to a degree of absurdity that signaled the show was mocking rather than celebrating the type. The jokes at Quagmire's expense, as much as through him, maintained a kind of satirical distance that gave the comedy some protective irony. That distance gradually collapsed in the later seasons, for the same reasons that other aspects of the show's approach to difficult material stopped working, which was that the self-awareness the show relied on to justify its content became less consistent in its application. There were episodes, particularly as the show went on, where Quagmire's behavior was framed without the ironic distance that made it function as satire rather than as simple celebration of the type. The character began appearing in storylines where his predatory behavior was present, but the frame of critique had been removed. The complication of Quagmire's function in the show reached a specific peak in the Jerome is the New Black episode from Season 8, which made Quagmire the vehicle for the famous speech about Brian. In this episode, a character whose defining trait is sexual predation and whose relationship to women has been the subject of legitimate audience discomfort was positioned as the show's moral center, delivering a righteous critique of Brian's hypocrisy. The speech was accurate. Everything Quagmire said about Brian was backed by the show's own depicted events. But the choice to give that speech to Quagmire, rather than to any other character, created an interesting problem. The show was using a morally compromised character to deliver moral clarity, and the episode did not address the gap between the messenger's credibility and the message's content. MacFarlane has in various contexts discussed Quagmire as a character who operates in the space of extreme comic exaggeration, arguing that the degree of absurdity involved signals to the audience that the show is not endorsing the behavior, but using it as comedic material in a specific tradition of transgressive comedy. Critics and fans who have found the character troubling have generally responded that the degree of exaggeration argument loses its force when the character's behavior is depicted without sufficient critical framing, when Quagmire is positioned as sympathetic or admirable in contexts that do not account for what his defining characteristic involves. The Meg and Quagmire episode, in which Quagmire briefly dates an adult version of Meg, and the Peter and Quagmire friendship dynamics in the later seasons, both reflect the show's ongoing unresolved relationship with a character it created for a specific comedic purpose, and then could not consistently maintain the right relationship with, as the show's overall approach to transgressive material changed. The Simpsons crossover and what it revealed. The 2014 crossover event between Family Guy and The Simpsons, titled The Simpsons Guy, was the most watched animated comedy episode in 13 years at the time of its broadcast. It drew over 10 million viewers, a number that dwarfed anything either show had been consistently achieving in their respective solo runs in the years leading up to the event. The crossover was, purely in terms of broadcast performance, a significant commercial success and a reminder that Family Guy still had the capacity to generate genuine television event viewing when given the right circumstances. The episode itself is interesting as a document of how Family Guy understood its own relationship to The Simpsons and to the legacy of animated comedy more broadly. The narrative framing placed Peter and the Griffin family in Springfield after a controversy drove them out of their own town, allowing the two families to interact across an episode that ran over 1 hour in length, substantially longer than a standard episode of either show. The tone of the crossover was good-natured on the surface but contained specific currents of competitive awareness running underneath. The episode made extensive jokes about the differences between the two shows, their different approaches to comedy, their different relationships to continuity and character development, their different physical aesthetics. The Simpsons' more naturalistic character designs were contrasted with Family Guy's more geometrically stylized ones. The Springfield characters responded to Family Guy-style cutaway gags with explicit confusion, a joke that acknowledged the formal difference between the shows, while also framing it as a critique of the cutaway format from within the crossover itself. The centerpiece of the episode was a parody of the trial format, using Peter and Homer as litigants disputing who had the right to a certain joke or comedic concept. This framing was a direct acknowledgement of the accusations of derivativeness that Family Guy had faced throughout its existence, the argument that it was essentially The Simpsons with different characters and more transgressive content. By making the dispute explicit and turning it into comedy, the episode was doing what Family Guy had always done with its critics, absorbing the criticism into its content rather than ignoring it or responding to it directly. The Meg and Lisa storyline within the crossover, in which Lisa recognized Meg's intelligence and her saxophone talent, treated Meg as a genuine character with actual dimensions rather than as a punching bag. This was one of several moments within the crossover that suggested The Simpsons writers and producers had noticed the treatment Meg received in Family Guy and were gently providing a corrective in their shared episode. Whether this was a deliberate creative choice or simply the result of Simpsons writers bringing their own characterization instincts to a Meg storyline, the effect was the same. Meg was treated with more respect in the crossover than she received in most of her own show's episodes. The crossover's enormous viewership demonstrated something specific about Family Guy's audience relationship at that point in the show's history. The roughly 2 million people who were watching new Family Guy episodes regularly in its post-peak period did not represent the full extent of the audience that was willing to engage with the show when given sufficient reason. The crossover's 10 million viewers included many people who had stopped watching Family Guy's regular run, but had sufficient residual affection for the show and sufficient curiosity about The Simpsons pairing to tune in for a major event. The show had a larger population of lapsed viewers, people who had loved it in its better years and moved on, than its regular ratings reflected. The Music Family Guy as a musical comedy. One of the more genuinely distinctive and consistently underappreciated aspects of Family Guy across its entire run is its relationship to music. The show has an ambition in its musical sequences that is unusual for an animated comedy, and the quality of those sequences represents one of the areas where the show maintained genuine excellence even through periods when other aspects of its quality were declining. MacFarlane himself is a serious musician. His big band and traditional pop recordings are not the products of a celebrity dabbling in music, but of someone with genuine facility in that tradition. He has a baritone voice with real depth and clarity, and his knowledge of the American popular music canon from the golden era of the mid-20th century is extensive and genuine. This background informs everything about how music functions in Family Guy. The show's original theme was specifically designed to evoke the musical world of Golden Age American variety television. The melody has the structure of a classic television theme, memorable and singable, and tonally optimistic in a way that sets up the domestic comedy premise. The arrangement uses big band instrumentation and harmonic sophistication that most animated comedy themes do not reach for. It sounds like something that could have appeared on a television program in 1965, which is simultaneously a reference to the tradition and a signal about the show's relationship to that tradition. Walter Murphy's scoring throughout the show's run maintains this musical sophistication. Murphy is a classically trained arranger and composer whose most famous pre-Family Guy work was the 1976 disco adaptation of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, a track called A Fifth of Beethoven that was a genuine commercial hit and demonstrated his facility with the creative dialogue between classical structure and contemporary popular form. His work on Family Guy brought that same harmonic sensibility to the task of scoring animated comedy, producing music that supports emotional beats with genuine musical intelligence rather than stock situational cues. The original musical numbers in Family Guy are its most direct expression of MacFarlane's musical ambitions. Episodes that center on elaborate original song sequences, including The Life of Riley, MacFarlane's tribute to entertainment number in the Season 4 episode where Quagmire faces consequences from past behavior, and the Road to Rhode Island sequence in which Brian and Stewie perform an extended musical travel number, demonstrate production values and compositional quality that were significantly above what was available in animated comedy at the time. The choreography of these numbers is not just drawn movement synchronized to pre-recorded music. It reflects genuine understanding of how musical performance works, how performers occupy physical space in a musical number, how camera angles serve the specific demands of that kind of entertainment. The tribute episodes and the Road to episodes gave the show specific contexts in which its musical ambitions could operate at their fullest extent. Road to Rhode Island in Season 2 is the first fully developed example of this kind of extended musical sequence in the show's run, and it holds up as a genuinely impressive piece of work. Brian and Stewie stranded together, trying to get home, performing a full musical number with the quality of a Broadway production miniaturized into a cartoon context. This is something Family Guy did that its closest competitors could not have produced with equivalent success. The cultural references that the show encoded in its musical sequences are another layer of its relationship to music. I Need a Jew from the Season 4 episode, whatever you think about the episode's overall content, is a fully realized pastiche of a specific strain of musical comedy built on detailed knowledge of the form it is imitating. The show's parodies of specific musical genres across its run, from showbiz to country to hip-hop to classical, consistently demonstrate more detailed knowledge of their subjects than lazy pastiche requires. MacFarlane and Murphy's shared musical literacy gave the show's musical comedy a grounding and genuine appreciation of what it was parodying. The cultural footprint what Family Guy changed. The influence of Family Guy on American popular culture between 1999 and the present extends further than its viewer numbers at any specific point in its run would suggest, and it operates through several different channels simultaneously. The most direct and quantifiable effect is the format inheritance. Adult animated comedies produced in the post-Family Guy era exist in a landscape that Family Guy helped shape. Shows that chose not to use cutaway gags made that choice in awareness of Family Guy. Shows that used cutaway gags built on a format that Family Guy had demonstrated and popularized. American Dad, which grew out of Family Guy's creative ecosystem, represents one direct legacy. Bob's Burgers, which occupied the same Fox animation block for years, was built in deliberate contrast to Family Guy's approach, favoring character warmth and story coherence over transgressive comedy. The existence of Bob's Burgers as a viable Fox property required Family Guy to have established that animated adult comedy could work in prime time, while Bob's Burgers itself represented a reaction against what Family Guy's approach had sometimes become. The cutaway gag as a comedic format, distributed and amplified by YouTube and other video-sharing platforms beginning in 2005, the same year of Family Guy's revival, created a specific vernacular for internet comedy that persisted long after the episodes that generated those specific clips had aired. A large proportion of the most shared Family Guy content on the internet consists of cutaway segments isolated from their context, which is precisely what critics of the format had argued was the format's fundamental problem. The content was designed to be clipped and distributed separately, and it was. Whether this was a creative failure or a prescient understanding of how comedy would be consumed in the internet era depends on what you think comedy is supposed to do. The show's approach to celebrity satire, to political commentary, to racial humor, and to disability humor established reference points that subsequent entertainment was navigating around or building on. Some of what Family Guy normalized in terms of comedic content the culture subsequently decided it had moved past. Some of what it did first or did most visibly establish the framework that later work refined. The conversation about what kinds of humor are acceptable in a given cultural moment in America was partially structured by the arguments Family Guy generated. The merchandise ecosystem built around Family Guy across its 25 years has produced physical objects that exist in homes and collections around the world. Stewie Griffin action figures, Brian Griffin plush toys, Peter Griffin costumes, Family Guy board games, Family Guy video games, Family Guy-themed merchandise of essentially every conceivable category. These objects represent a specific kind of cultural penetration. They mean that the characters exist in three-dimensional physical form in people's daily environments, which is a different kind of presence from appearing on screens. The fan community that formed around Family Guy across its history developed its own specific culture. Online discussions, fan wikis, fan fiction, fan art, And the incredibly detailed continuity analysis that fan communities conduct generated a body of interpretive work around the show that exceeds what any conventional critical apparatus produced. The fan theories explored earlier in this script are one specific output of this community, but the broader enterprise of fans treating Family Guy's internal consistency, its production history, its character arcs, and its cultural references as a subject worth serious, sustained attention represents a specific kind of cultural value that commercial success metrics do not capture. The show also influenced how other media thought about an audience demographic that networks had historically underserved. The college-age and young adult male viewer who stayed up late, who was not captured by traditional primetime programming, who wanted comedy that reflected his specific sensibility and did not talk down to him. Family Guy was extremely good at reaching this person. The show's relationship to this demographic, and the way it shaped what this demographic expected and wanted from comedy, is one of its more diffuse but genuine legacies. What is perhaps most interesting about Family Guy's cultural footprint is its persistence despite the show's declining quality. People who stopped watching Family Guy regularly years ago still reference it. Characters and catchphrases from its golden era remain in active cultural circulation. The Stewie Griffin of Season 2 and 3 is more culturally present in some ways than the Stewie Griffin of Season 20, not because more people watched him in the earlier seasons, but because the impression those early seasons made was deep enough to sustain. This is what the best work in the show's history actually accomplished. It created characters and moments that became part of the shared reference library of a generation of viewers, images and phrases and dynamics that people carry in their memories and deploy in their conversations long after they have stopped keeping up with the show that produced them. The golden era of Family Guy had that quality, the quality of work that lodges in people and stays. That is not nothing. That is actually rather a lot. End of expansion content. The recurring characters' forgotten faces with hidden histories. Family Guy built a population around the Griffin household that operated in the background of 25 years of stories, and some of the most interesting things about the show's world live in the recurring supporting characters who received significantly less attention than their narrative potential warranted. Cleveland Brown began as one of Peter's 4 core friends, a mild-mannered, soft-spoken man whose defining quality was a patience so extreme it occasionally bordered on passivity. Cleveland's voice, delivered by Mike Henry, had a specific gentleness to it that created a particular comedic contrast with the chaos that perpetually surrounded him. When Cleveland sat in a bathtub on the second floor of his house, and the tub came crashing through the floor in the episode's opening sequence, his unhurried verbal acknowledgement of what was happening before the fall happened became one of the show's most reliably structured running gags. The joke required Cleveland's specific quality of unflappable verbal deliberateness. It would not have worked with any other character. Cleveland was spun off into his own show, The Cleveland Show, in 2009, which ran for 4 seasons before ending in 2013 and returning Cleveland to the Family Guy fold. The spin-off's existence is interesting as a measure of what the parent show believed Cleveland could sustain narratively. The Cleveland Show attempted to give him a full family context, similar to what the Griffins had, with a new wife, stepchildren, and his own son from a previous marriage. The result demonstrated that Cleveland worked best as one element within an ensemble, rather than as a lead character carrying the full weight of his own production. His return to Family Guy after the Cleveland Show's conclusion slightly changed his dynamic with the group. He had experienced something his friends had not, the attempt to lead his own narrative, and the failure of that attempt carried its own implicit information about his character and his role. The show did not develop this dimension explicitly, but the knowledge that Cleveland had been to his own show and come back existed as background context for viewers who had followed the whole story. Joe Swanson's arc over the show's run illustrates something specific about how Family Guy handled disabled characters. Joe entered the show in the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door as a police officer who used a wheelchair following an injury sustained in the line of duty. In this early episode, Joe was the object of Peter's admiration and jealousy, the new neighbor who was respected and liked by the community in ways that Peter wanted to be. Joe's disability was part of his character but did not define how the show positioned him. He was presented as capable, accomplished, admirable. His wheelchair was a feature of his physical situation, not the primary lens through which he was understood. This changed progressively as the show went on. By the middle of the run, Joe's wheelchair had become the most prominent fact about him in the show's comedic treatment. The dynamic flipped from Joe being admired despite his disability to Joe being mocked because of it. Peter, who had once been jealous of Joe's community standing, became one of the people whose jokes at Joe's expense were most frequent and most pointed. Bonnie, Joe's wife, went through a storyline in which her frustrations with their marriage and her resentment of Joe's disability-related limitations were played for humor in ways that the show's earlier treatment of Joe would not have. Supported. The Swanson baby storyline, in which Bonnie was visibly pregnant for approximately 7 real-world years across more than 100 episodes, accumulated into a continuity anomaly that fans tracked with the kind of detailed attention the show generated at its most committed. The pregnancy extended so far past biological plausibility that it became its own background running joke, a piece of the show that was clearly not being managed with active intention but that took on a specific quality through its sheer duration. When Susie Swanson was eventually born in Season 8, the resolution of this long anomaly was itself a notable event, marking one of the longest-running unresolved narrative threads in American animated comedy. Meg's peer group at James Woods Regional High School, the social ecosystem that surrounded her daily suffering, contained specific recurring characters whose own histories were more developed in some episodes than others. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl who served as Meg's primary social antagonist, had moments where the show explored what drove her cruelty, including at least one episode that suggested she was not fundamentally different from Meg in her actual emotional situation, but had chosen different survival mechanisms. These moments added complexity to a character who was most often used as a simple antagonist, and they demonstrated, as episodes involving Meg herself often demonstrated, that the writing room knew how to do more with these characters than it typically chose to do. Mort Goldman, voiced by John Wiener, occupied a specific niche in the show's supporting cast as the hypochondriac Jewish pharmacist whose relationship with the Griffin family was largely defined by his function as a vehicle for a particular category of joke. Mort's son Neil had a long-running crush on Meg that was consistently played as a reversal of Meg's own social position, Neil being so far below even Meg's social standing that his romantic interest in her was framed as somehow equivalent to being spurned. The implications of this framing were not ones the show spent much time examining. Tricia Takanawa and other local news figures from Quahog's television landscape appeared periodically in ways that anchored the show's world in a civic infrastructure with its own internal logic. Tom Tucker, the news anchor voiced by Seth MacFarlane, in a vocal register entirely distinct from his other characters, had storylines across the show's run that explored his personal life and his specific quality of professional confidence masking various forms of inadequacy. These characters gave the show a populated world that felt lived in and specific, rather than assembled purely for the Griffin family's benefit. The viewer relationship? What 25 years looks like from the couch. There is a specific experience of watching a show for 25 years that is different from any other kind of engagement with entertainment, and Family Guy has generated that experience for a large enough population of viewers that it constitutes its own significant piece of the show's history. Someone who was 15 when Family Guy premiered in January 1999 would be 40 years old in 2024. The show has been part of their viewing life across the transition from adolescence, through young adulthood, through full adult life, with its own particular accumulations and losses. The version of Family Guy they watched at 15 was not the version they encountered at 35, and the difference was not just a matter of the show having changed. They had changed too. The jokes that struck them as thrillingly transgressive at 15 read differently at 35, not because the jokes themselves changed, but because the viewer's relationship to their own transgressiveness changed. This longitudinal relationship between a specific generation of viewers and a specific show produces particular effects. Family Guy became for many of these viewers a kind of reference object, something they carry with them from a specific period of their lives that has accumulated meaning not purely from the show's content, but from what was happening in their own lives when they were watching. The early seasons of Family Guy are, for many people, inseparable from the specific texture of staying up late, of watching television in a shared space with friends, of the particular energy of being young and newly exposed to comedy that was made with you specifically in mind. The shift in how these viewers related to the show as it changed is itself worth dwelling on. People who were loyal to Family Guy during its golden era and then found themselves drifting away during the later seasons experienced something specific: the gradual realization that the show they were watching was no longer the show they had fallen in love with, and the complicated emotional process of deciding what to do with that. Some stayed and adjusted their expectations. Some stopped watching the new episodes but continued consuming the early seasons through streaming. Some cut off the show entirely and experienced something that feels disproportionately intense for an entertainment relationship but is genuinely common: the specific grief of losing something that mattered to them. The parasocial dimensions of watching a show for 25 years are unusual in their intensity. Characters in a show watched across that span of time accumulate emotional significance that exceeds what any specific episode's events justify. Brian Griffin means something to people who watched him in the early seasons that has nothing to do with what Brian Griffin does in any individual episode. The meaning is the accumulation of many evenings, many shared viewings, many specific moments that lodged and stayed. When the show killed Brian and then brought him back, the reaction was disproportionate in commercial terms because Brian meant things to viewers that commercial logic did not have a unit for. The late-night viewing context that forms the backbone of this video's own existence is part of this relationship. Family Guy has been a late-night companion for a specific kind of viewer, someone watching in the quiet hours, alone or nearly alone, when the day's noise has settled and entertainment can take on a different quality. The show's rhythm, the quick movements between different kinds of humor, the familiar characters doing familiar things, the jokes that land and the ones that do not, all of this is well suited to a particular state of late-night receptiveness. The memories attached to specific episodes or specific seasons are a real and significant component of Family Guy's legacy in the lives of its long-term viewers. Someone might remember exactly where they were and who they were with when they first saw a specific episode. Someone else might have a family in-joke that was seeded by a line from a Season 3 episode. Someone might have introduced their younger sibling to the show by watching specific early episodes together. These specific memories, attached to this specific piece of entertainment, are part of what the show has produced across its run. The show's longevity means it has been there across the significant events of a generation's collective life. Family Guy was on when the September 11th attacks happened, when the financial crisis hit, when political landscapes shifted in ways that made the show's political content land differently than it had originally, when social conversations about humor and harm changed in ways that retroactively problematized content the show had produced years earlier. The show was not made in a vacuum, and it was not watched in one either. What this long relationship between show and viewer means is that Family Guy's actual significance to its audience is not fully captured by the ratings numbers at any specific point in its run. The viewers who stopped watching new episodes years ago still carry something from the show. The people who stayed all the way through have a relationship with the show that spans experiences and decades. The show they are watching in its later seasons is embedded in a history of watching the show that gives it meaning it would not have if encountered fresh. Even a disappointing episode, watched by someone who has been watching for 20 years, carries the weight of everything that came before it. That weight is part of what makes Family Guy interesting to think about. Even now, even in its compromised later form, the show is not just what it currently is. It is also what it was, and what it was is still there in the memories of everyone who watched it then. The early seasons do not stop being good because the later ones are worse. The Peter who loved his family in Season 2 does not retroactively stop having loved them because the Peter of Season 15 is a different person. The history is layered, and the layers are all still present, and sitting with all of them together in the quiet of late night is one of the more honest ways to understand what Family Guy actually has been across its remarkable, contradictory, frustrating, and sometimes genuinely beautiful run. The smaller, unanswered questions, mysteries the show never resolved. Beyond the large mysteries discussed earlier in this script, Family Guy accumulated across its 25-year run a collection of smaller, more specific unanswered questions that the show planted and then moved past without resolution. Some of these are genuine continuity puzzles. Some appear to be deliberate choices to raise questions without answering them. Some are probably the result of a writing room producing enormous amounts of content across many years without the infrastructure to track every implication of everything it introduced. All of them are interesting. The question of what happened to Peter's biological father is one that the show introduced, developed across several episodes, and then allowed to become dormant. In the season 15 episode, Peter's Sister, the show established that Peter had a complicated relationship with his own sibling history, but the specific storyline about his Irish biological father, Liam Neegan, introduced in season 14, involved Peter discovering a whole dimension of his heritage that was new to him. The episodes exploring this gave Peter some emotional depth that his flanderized later characterization rarely reached for. But the questions that storyline opened about how this discovery changed Peter's sense of his own identity were not developed in subsequent episodes. The show added something significant to Peter's backstory and then treated it as though it had not happened. The fate of the Griffin's second home is another specific continuity puzzle. In the season 2 episode Peter, Caviar Eater, Lois inherits the Pewterschmidt Summer Estate, a genuinely enormous property. The Griffins use the estate for the duration of that episode, and then it essentially vanishes from the show's world. A property of that size would represent a genuine change in the economic circumstances of a family living in a modest house in Rhode Island, but the inheritance is never used as a significant resource or plot element in subsequent episodes. The show introduced a material fact about the Griffins' financial situation and then proceeded as though it had not done so. The question of Brian's son Dylan, who appeared in a handful of episodes, represents another thread the show picked up and put down without fully resolving. Brian fathered a son, Dylan was introduced, Brian and Dylan had some development as characters in relationship to each other, and then Dylan's appearances became increasingly rare before effectively stopping. The show had introduced a biological child for Brian, who was simultaneously being developed as a character who was increasingly failing at relationships and responsibilities, and then set aside the most direct possible test of Brian's capacity for genuine, sustained commitment. The origin of Quagmire's name is one of those small puzzles that the show never addressed, which is somewhat unusual given how much the show eventually played with meta-references to its own construction. Glenn Quagmire is an extraordinary name for a Rhode Island airline pilot living next door to a working-class family. The show never provided an in-universe account of why this person has this name, which is fine as a simple matter of character naming convention, but which accumulated into a mild puzzle as the show became increasingly willing to address and joke about its own conventions and choices. The question of whether Stewie's time machine is canonical within the show's primary reality, or whether its existence is limited to specific kinds of episodes, is something the show handled inconsistently. Some episodes use the time machine as a straightforward plot device with genuine consequences that persisted into subsequent episodes. Other episodes appeared to use it in a more self-contained way, where the events produced by the time travel were isolated from the show's ongoing continuity. The exact rules governing which category any specific time travel episode belonged to were never established, which meant that viewers could not determine with confidence whether a given time travel event was part of the show's actual history or a one-off narrative excursion. Herbert the Pervert, the elderly neighbor with a troubling interest in Chris, is a character whose inclusion in the show represents one of its more uncomfortable ongoing choices. Herbert was introduced as a comedic figure, and his specific predatory quality toward Chris was part of the joke that his character was built around. The show continued to use Herbert well into its later seasons, treating him as an established supporting character with enough accumulated familiarity that his specific, disturbing quality had been domesticated by repetition. The discomfort of the character's premise was never addressed within the show's world, which consistently treated Herbert's behavior as a comedic inconvenience rather than as something requiring intervention. This represents one of the clearest examples of the show's difficulty in maintaining critical distance from its own transgressive content over extended periods. The mystery of what, exactly, Peter does professionally across the show's run is worth noting. Peter began at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, which he was fired from. He worked at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery for a long stretch of the show's middle seasons. But across the later seasons, Peter's employment became increasingly inconsistent and episodic, with various temporary or implausible jobs appearing for single episodes before disappearing. The economic logic of the Griffin household, which required Peter to be earning some kind of income to maintain their house and lifestyle, was handled with increasing casualness as the show's interest in grounding its characters in recognizable working-class circumstances diminished. These smaller, unresolved threads, taken together, paint a picture of a show that was generating an enormous amount of narrative material across a very long production run, and that did not always have the organizational infrastructure or the creative intention to track the implications of everything it introduced. Some of what looks like mystery from outside was probably simply the result of a writing room working at speed and volume without a comprehensive continuity document. Some of it was probably deliberate choice. The distinction between the two is not always clear from the viewer's position, which is itself interesting. The show that appears mysterious from outside is sometimes simply a show that was not fully attending to its own history. The final midnight thought. There is something to be said for shows that outlast their own best intentions. Family Guy is not the show it was, and the distance between what it was and what it became is real and significant and worth being honest about. But something persists in the fact of its 25 years that is worth sitting with rather than dismissing. The show is full of people who started as ideas and became something you could love or despise or feel complicated about in ways that ideas alone cannot produce. Peter Griffin at his best is one of the most recognizable figures in American comedy, the lovable fool who means well and keeps getting it wrong and keeps trying anyway. And even if the show eventually turned him into something less sympathetic, that original Peter does not disappear. He is still there in the early episodes. Brian Griffin at his best is the version of yourself you want to be, the one who has read the books and has the perspective and can see through the nonsense. And even if the show eventually showed you every way that version of yourself can fail, the aspiration does not vanish entirely. Stewie Griffin in his original form remains one of the most conceptually brilliant character creations in the history of animated television, the evil genius baby who exists in perfect comic contrast to his own circumstances, and the sadness of watching that character gradually softened and made safe is genuine. But the softening itself told a story about what happens when the people responsible for something extraordinary are not sure they can keep finding the extraordinary in it, and that story is its own kind of honesty. Meg Griffin is the most sympathetic character in a show that spent the better part of a decade trying to ensure she received as little sympathy as possible, and the specific quality of her endurance through everything the show put her through is something worth acknowledging. She is still there. She came through it. Family Guy at its best was funny in ways that stayed with you, that you carried into the world and referenced in conversations and returned to in your memory when life offered you the specific situation the show had already mapped. At its worst, it was a machine producing content, running past its creative life because the economics supported the continuation. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The distance between them is part of what makes the show worth thinking about. The mysteries that run through it, the questions about who can hear Stewie and who Meg's father really is, and what Stewie originally was supposed to become, and why the show that stood in the shadow of The Simpsons ended up producing something that, in its best moments, rivaled its predecessor. All of these questions do not have clean answers. They have partial answers, and contextual answers, and answers that generate more questions. That is why they are worth bringing up late at night, in the quiet hours, when the day is over and the quality of attention changes. Family Guy is 30 years old in 2029. Whatever it looks like by then, the 25 years it has already produced contain enough to think about for another 25. The good parts were genuinely good. The mysteries are genuinely mysterious. The decline is real and documented. The thing that outlasted all of it, the thing that made people miss it when it changed and made them stay with it even when it disappointed them, is the specific warmth that lives in the early seasons, the sense that somewhere inside all the chaos, there was a family that actually loved each other. That warmth was the thing the show had and lost and occasionally found again and never fully recovered. It was also the thing that made everything else in the show possible. Without it, the transgression was just noise. Without it, the cutaways were just filler. Without it, the characters were just designs moving across a screen. With it, it was something that millions of people chose to watch instead of sleeping late at night for 25 years. That is not nothing. That is a lot. One last thing, the show that would not stay dead. There is a particular phrase that gets used in television production circles when a show demonstrates unusual commercial resilience. They say it has legs. It means the show can keep going, keep generating, keep providing something that justifies its continued existence, even when circumstances suggest it might reasonably end. Family Guy has had legs in ways that confounded every reasonable prediction. When Fox canceled it in 2002, the conventional wisdom said it was done. When Adult Swim's rerun ratings exploded and the DVD numbers came back, that wisdom was revised in real time. When the show returned and spent seasons finding its footing again, critics argued it was a creative disappointment that had burned through its goodwill. It kept going. When the ratings began their long decline from the heights of the revival era, industry analysts noted that the numbers could not sustain a live-action show and wondered how long the animation economics would continue to make continuation sensible. The answer turned out to be all the way through season 27 and the show's 30th anniversary. The show that would not stay dead is also, in a different sense, the show that carries its dead with it. The characters who changed irreversibly are still in there somewhere beneath what they became. The writers who left are in the DNA of what they contributed before they went. The original vision, however attenuated by years of production decisions that moved away from it, is still the substrate on which everything else was built. MacFarlane, recording voices in a booth for a show he no longer steers creatively, is still putting something of himself into Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire every time he records. The characters come through his voice. Whatever complicated feelings he has about the show's direction, about Fox, about the distance between what Family Guy is and what he once imagined it could be, all of that is present in some form when he sits down and becomes these people again. The original creator is still there, even if the original creation has become something different around him. There is a kind of loyalty in the show's survival that mirrors the loyalty of its audience in ways that feel appropriate. The fans who kept buying DVDs when the show was canceled and drove Adult Swim's ratings up by nearly 240% were not being rational commercial actors. They were being loyal to something they loved. The show's continuation past the point where its ratings would justify it is not purely a rational commercial calculation either. It is partly the inertia of something that has been running for a very long time, yes, and partly the economics of animation, yes. But it is also the accumulated weight of 25 years during which the show meant something to people, and the difficulty of ending something that carries that weight. Family Guy is not finished. More episodes are coming, more seasons are contracted. The Griffin family will keep living on Spooner Street, keep getting into situations, keep delivering cutaway gags and some genuine jokes and occasional surprising moments of real character and feeling. The Stewie who wanted to take over the world and kill his mother will continue not doing those things, instead having feelings and friendships and personal crises. Brian will continue being complicated in all the ways the show has made him complicated. Meg will, hopefully, continue her late-era trend toward being treated as an actual person rather than a designated target. The mysteries will continue accumulating. New Easter eggs will be placed in backgrounds for viewers with the patience to pause their screens. New episodes will be released that contradict previous episodes in small and medium and occasionally significant ways. The show will continue being exactly itself in all its contradictions, loud and quiet, mean and warm, brilliantly funny in specific moments and exhaustingly lazy in others. And somewhere in America and in other countries and in time zones spread all the way around the world, people will be watching it late at night when they cannot sleep, in the particular quality of attention that belongs to those hours, and the Griffins will be doing what the Griffins do, and the watching will feel like something that has always been there, because for a lot of people, it has. That is what 30 years on television means. Not that the show is perfect or consistent or always worth the time. It means it became part of the furniture of people's lives. It means it was there. And the things that were genuinely good in it, the things that made people love it in the first place, are still there if you know where to look. They are worth looking for. If you found something in this one worth staying up for, leave a comment below. Tell me what mystery from the show you have always wanted answered, or which season you think is genuinely underrated, or just tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Those comments matter more than you might think. And if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribing takes 5 seconds and it is what keeps this channel going. Thank you for spending these hours here. Sleep well. The thing about mysteries is that they are most interesting when they resist clean resolution. A mystery that gets answered becomes a fact. A mystery that persists becomes something else, a part of the texture of a thing, an opening that remains open and invites you back to look through it again. Family Guy has more of those openings than it has resolutions. The questions about who Stewie was supposed to become, and what the writers originally intended, and why Brian changed, and what Meg's real history is, none of these have fully satisfying answers. The show generated them and lived with them and sometimes returned to them and never quite closed them. After 25 years, they are still there, still open, still worth looking through. That is unusual for a comedy. Comedies are supposed to resolve. They are supposed to end each episode with the chaos settled and the family intact and the status quo restored. Family Guy mostly did that, formally, structurally. But underneath the formal resolution, underneath the returning to normal that each episode performed, the real questions kept accumulating. The real question was always whether this family, this strange collection of people stuck with each other on a fictional street in a state where the show's creator grew up, actually held together. In the early seasons, the answer was clearly yes. In the middle seasons, it became less clear. In the later seasons, the question was sometimes hard to ask without feeling like the answer might be no. But they are still there. They are still on that street. The house is still standing. Maybe that is the mystery that matters most. Not the Stewie theories or the Stan Thompson questions or the animation studio histories or the production secrets. The mystery is how a family stays together across everything. Family Guy has been asking that question for 25 years, in its noisy, indirect way, and it has not found an answer yet. Neither have most of us. That is why we keep watching.